The Blue Geranium. "When I was down here last year," said Sir Henry Clithering, and stopped. His hostess, Mrs. Bantry, looked at him curiously. The ex-commissioner of Scotland Yard was staying with old friends of his, Colonel and Mrs. Bantry, who lived near St. Mary Mead. Mrs. Bantry, pen in hand, had just asked his advice as to who should be invited to make a sixth guest at a dinner that evening. "Yes," said Mrs. Bantry encouragingly, "when you were here last year." "Tell me," said Sir Henry, "do you know a Miss Marple?" Mrs. Bantry was surprised, the last thing she had expected. "No, Miss Marple? Who doesn't? The typical old maid of fiction. Quite a dear, but hopelessly behind the times. Do you mean you'd like me to ask her to dinner?" "You're surprised?" "A little, I must confess. I should hardly have thought you, but, well, perhaps there's an explanation." "The explanation's simple enough. When I was down here last year, we got into the habit of discussing unsolved mysteries. There were 5 or 6 of us. Raymond West, the novelist, started it. We each supplied a story to which we knew the answer, but nobody else did. Supposed to be an exercise in the deductive faculties to see who could get nearest the truth." "Well?" "Like in the old story, we hardly realized that Miss Marple was playing, but we were very polite about it. Didn't want to hurt the old dear's feelings. And now comes the cream of the jest. The old lady outdid us every time." "What?" "I'll show you. Straight to the truth like a homing pigeon." "But how extraordinary! Why, dear old Miss Marple has hardly ever been out to St. Mary Mead." "Ah, but according to her, that has given her unlimited opportunities of observing human nature. Under the microscope, as it were." "I suppose there's something in that," conceded Mrs. Bantry. "One would at least know the petty side of people. But I don't think we have any really exciting criminals in our midst. I think we must try her with Arthur's ghost story after dinner. I'd be thankful if she found a solution to that." "I didn't know that Arthur believed in ghosts." "Oh, he doesn't. That's what worries him so. It happened to a friend of his, George Pritchard. Most prosaic person. It's really rather tragic for poor George. Either this extraordinary story is true, or else... Or else what?" Mrs. Bantry did not answer. After a minute or two, she said irrelevantly, "You know, I like George. Everyone does. One can't believe that he... but people do such extraordinary things." Sir Henry nodded. He knew better than Mrs. Bantry the extraordinary things that people did. "So it came about that evening." Mrs. Bantry looked round her dinner table, shivering a little as she did so, because the dining-room, like most English dining-rooms, was extremely cold, and fixed her gaze on the very upright old lady sitting on her husband's right. Miss Marple wore black lace mittens. An old lace fichu was draped round her shoulders, and another piece of lace surmounted her white hair. She was talking animatedly to the elderly Dr. Lloyd, about the workhouse and the suspected shortcomings of the district nurse. Mrs. Bantry marvelled anew. She even wondered whether Sir Henry had been making an elaborate joke, but there seemed no point in that. Incredible that what he has said could be really true. Her glance went on and rested affectionately on her red-faced, broad-shouldered husband as he sat talking horses to Jane Hellyer, the beautiful and popular actress. Jane, more beautiful, if that were possible, off the stage than on, opened her enormous blue eyes and murmured at discreet intervals, "Really? Oh, fancy! How extraordinary!" She knew nothing whatever about horses and cared less. "Arthur," said Mrs. Bantry, "you're boring poor Jane to distraction. Leave horses alone and tell her your ghost story instead. You know, George Pritchard." "Eh, Dolly?" "Oh, but I don't know. Sir Henry wants to hear it too. I was telling him something about it this morning. It'll be interesting to hear what everyone has to say about it." "Oh, do," said Jane. "I love ghost stories." "Well," Colonel Bantry hesitated, "I've never believed much in the supernatural, but this... I don't think any of you know George Pritchard. He's one of the best. His wife... well, she's dead now, poor woman. I'll just say this much. She didn't give George any too easy a time when she was alive. She was one of those semi-invalids. I believe she really had something wrong with her, but whatever it was, she played it for all it was worth. She was capricious, exacting, unreasonable. She complained from morning to night. George was expected to wait on her hand and foot, and everything he did was always wrong, and he got cursed for it. Most men, I'm fully convinced, would have hit her over the head with a hatchet long ago. Eh, Dolly, isn't that so?" "She was a dreadful woman," said Mrs. Bantry with conviction. "If George Pritchard had brained her with a hatchet, and there had been any woman on the jury, he would have been triumphantly acquitted. I don't quite know how this business started. George was rather vague about it. I gather Mrs. Pritchard had always had a weakness for fortune-tellers, palmists, clairvoyants, anything of that sort. George didn't mind. She found amusement in it, well and good. But he refused to go into rhapsodies himself, and that was another grievance. A succession of hospital nurses was always passing through the house, Mrs. Pritchard usually becoming dissatisfied with them after a few weeks. One young nurse had been very keen on this fortune-telling stunt, and for a time Mrs. Pritchard had been very fond of her. Then she suddenly fell out with her and insisted on her going. She had back another nurse who had been with her previously, an older woman, experienced and tactful in dealing with a neurotic patient. Nurse Copling, according to George, was a very good sort, a sensible woman to talk to. She put up with Mrs. Pritchard's tantrums and nerve storms with complete indifference. Mrs. Pritchard always lunched upstairs, and it was usual at lunchtime for George and the nurse to come to some arrangement for the afternoon. Strictly speaking, the nurse went off from 2 to 4, but to oblige, as the phrase goes, she would sometimes take her time off after tea if George wanted to be free for the afternoon. On this occasion she mentioned that she was going to see her sister at Golders Green and might be a little late returning. George's face fell, for he had arranged to play a round of golf. Nurse Copling, however, reassured him. "We'll neither of us be missed, Mr. Pritchard." A twinkle came into her eye. "Mrs. Pritchard's going to have more exciting company than ours." "Who's that?" "Wait a minute." Nurse Copling's eyes twinkled more than ever. "Now let me get it right. Zarida, psychic reader of the future." "Oh, Lord," groaned George. "It's a new one, isn't it?" "Quite new. I believe my predecessor, Nurse Carstairs, sent her along. Mrs. Pritchard hasn't seen her yet. She made me write, fixing an appointment for this afternoon." "Well, at any rate, I shall get my golf," said George, and he went off with the kindliest feelings towards Zarida, the reader of the future. On his return to the house, he found Mrs. Pritchard in a state of great agitation. She was, as usual, lying on her invalid couch, and she had a bottle of smelling salts in her hand, which she sniffed at frequent intervals. "George," she exclaimed, "what did I tell you about this house? The moment I came into it, I felt there was something wrong. Didn't I tell you so at the time?" Repressing his desire to reply, "You always do," George said, "No, can't say I remember it." "You never do remember anything that has to do with me. Men are all extraordinarily callous. But I really believe that you are more insensitive than most. Oh, come now, Mary, dear, that's not fair. Well, as I was telling you, this woman knew at once. She actually blanched, if you know what I mean. She came in at that door and she said, "There is evil here, evil and danger, I feel it." Very unwisely, George laughed. "Well, you've had your money's worth this afternoon." His wife closed her eyes and took a long sniff from her smelling bottle. "How you hate me! You would jeer and laugh if I were dying." George protested, and after a minute or two she went on, "You may laugh, but I tell you the whole thing. This house is definitely dangerous to me. The woman said so." George's formerly kind feelings towards Zarida underwent a change. He knew his wife was perfectly capable of insisting on moving to a new house if the caprice got hold of her. "What else did she say?" he asked. "Well, she couldn't tell me very much. She was so upset. One thing she did say, I had some violets in a glass. She pointed at them and cried out, 'Take those away, no blue flowers, never have blue flowers. Blue flowers are fatal to you, remember that.' And you know," added Mrs. Pritchard, "I always have told you that blue as a colour is repellent to me. I feel a natural instinctive sort of warning against it." George was much too wise to remark that he had never heard her say so before. Instead, he asked what the mysterious Zarida was like. Mrs. Pritchard entered with gusto upon a description. Black-haired in coiled knobs over her ears. Her eyes were half closed, great black rims round them. She had a black veil over her mouth and chin. She spoke in a kind of singing voice with a marked foreign accent. Spanish, I think. "In fact, all the usual stock in trade," said George cheerfully. His wife immediately closed her eyes. "I feel extremely ill," she said. "Ring for nurse. Unkindness upsets me, and you know it only too well." It was 2 days later that Nurse Copling came to George with a grave face. "Will you come to Mrs. Pritchard, please? She's had a letter which upsets her greatly." He found his wife with a letter in her hand. She held it out to him. "Read it," she said. George read it. It was on heavily scented paper, and the writing was big and black. "I have seen the future. Be warned before it is too late. Beware of the full moon. The blue primrose means warning. The blue hollyhock means danger. The blue geranium means death." Just about to burst out laughing, George caught Nurse Copling's eye. She made a quick warning gesture. He said rather awkwardly, "The woman's probably trying to frighten you, Mary. Anyway, there aren't such things as blue primroses and blue geraniums." But Mrs. Pritchard began to cry and say her days were numbered. Nurse Copling came out with George upon the landing. "Of all the silly tomfoolery," he burst out. "I suppose it is." Something in the nurse's tone struck him, and he stared at her in amazement. "Surely, nurse, you don't believe—" No, Mr. Pritchard, I don't believe in reading the future. That's nonsense. What puzzles me is the meaning of this. Fortune-tellers are usually out for what they can get, but this woman seemed to be frightening Mrs. Pritchard with no advantage to herself. I can't see the point. There's another thing." "Yes?" "Mrs. Pritchard says that something about Zarida was faintly familiar to her." "Well?" "Well, I don't like it, Mr. Pritchard, that's all." "I didn't know you were so superstitious, nurse." "I'm not superstitious, but I know when a thing is fishy." It was about 4 days after this that the first incident happened. To explain it to you, I shall have to describe Mrs. Pritchard's room." "You better let me do that," interrupted Mrs. Bantry. It was prepared with one of these new wallpapers where you apply clumps of flowers to make a kind of herbaceous border. The effect is almost like being in a garden, though, of course, the flowers are all wrong. I mean, they simply couldn't be in bloom all at the same time. "Don't let a passion for horticultural accuracy run away with you, Dolly," said her husband. "We all know you're an enthusiastic gardener." "Well, it is absurd," protested Mrs. Bantry, "to have bluebells and daffodils and lupins and hollyhocks and Michaelmas daisies all grouped together." "Most unscientific," said Sir Henry. "But to proceed with the story." "Well, amongst these massed flowers were primroses, clumps of yellow and pink primroses, and, Oh, go on, Arthur, this is your story." Colonel Bantry took up the tale. "Mrs. Pritchard rang her bell violently one morning. The household came running. Thought she was in extremis. Not at all. She was violently excited and pointing at the wallpaper, and sure enough was one blue primrose in the midst of the others." "Oh," said Miss Helier, "how creepy." "The question was, hadn't the blue primrose always been there? That was George's suggestion and the nurse's, but Mrs. Pritchard wouldn't have it at any price. She had never noticed it till that very morning, and the night before it had been full moon. She was very upset about it. "I met George Pritchard that same day, and he told me about it," said Mrs. Bantry. "I went to see Mrs. Pritchard and did my best to ridicule the whole thing, but without success. I came away really concerned, and I remember I met Jean Instow and told her about it. Jean's a queer girl. She said, 'So she's really upset about it.' I told her that I thought the woman was perfectly capable of dying of fright. She was really abnormally superstitious. I remember Jean rather startled me with what she said next. She said, 'Well, that might be all for the best, mightn't it?' And she said it so coolly, in so matter-of-fact a tone, that I was really, well, shocked. Of course, I know it's done nowadays to be brutal and outspoken, but I never get used to it." Jean smiled at me rather oddly and said, "You don't like my saying that, but it's true. What use is Mrs. Pritchard's life to her? None at all. And it's hell for George Pritchard. Have his wife frightened out of existence would be the best thing that could happen to him." I said, "George is most awfully good to her always," and she said, "Yes, he deserves a reward, poor dear. He's a very attractive person, George Pritchard. The last nurse thought so, the pretty one. What was her name? Carstairs. That was the cause of the row between her and Mrs. P." Now, I didn't like hearing Jean say that. Of course, one had wondered. Mrs. Bantry paused significantly. "Yes, dear," said Miss Marple placidly, "one always does. Is Miss Instow a pretty girl? I suppose she plays golf?" "Yes, she's good at games, and she's nice-looking, attractive-looking, very fair, with healthy skin and nice steady blue eyes. Of course, we've always felt that she and George Pritchard, I mean, if things had been different, they're so well suited to one another." "And they were friends?" asked Miss Marple. "Oh, yes, great friends." "Do you think, Dolly," said Colonel Bantry plaintively, "that I might be allowed to go on with my story?" "Arthur," said Mrs. Bantry resignedly, "wants to get back to his ghosts." "I had the rest of the story from George himself," went on the Colonel. "There's no doubt that Mrs. Pritchard got the wind up badly towards the end of the next month. She marked off on a calendar the day when the moon would be full, and on that night she had both the nurse and then George into her room and made them study the wallpaper carefully. There were pink hollyhocks and red ones, but there were no blue amongst them. Then, when George left the room, she locked the door. And in the morning there was a large blue high-hawk, said Miss Helier joyfully. Quite right, said Colonel Bantry, or at any rate nearly right. One flower of a hollyhock just above her head had turned blue. Staggered George, and of course the more it staggered him, the more he refused to take the thing seriously. He insisted that the whole thing was some kind of practical joke. He ignored the evidence of the locked door and the fact that Mrs. Pritchard discovered the change before anyone, even Nurse Copling, was admitted. It staggered George, and it made him unreasonable. His wife wanted to leave the house, and he wouldn't let her. He was inclined to believe in the supernatural for the first time, but he wasn't going to admit it. He usually gave in to his wife, but this time he wouldn't. Mary was not to make a fool of herself, he said. The whole thing was the most infernal nonsense. And so the next month sped away. Mrs. Pritchard made less protest than one would have imagined. I think she was superstitious enough to believe that she couldn't escape her fate. She repeated again and again, the blue primrose, warning, the blue hollyhock, danger, the blue geranium, death. And she would lie looking at the clump of pinky-red geraniums nearest her bed. The whole business was pretty nervy. Even the nurse caught the infection. She came to George 2 days before full moon and begged him to take Mrs. Pritchard away. George was angry. If all the flowers on that damned wall turned into blue devils, it couldn't kill anyone, he shouted. It might. Shock has killed people before now. Nonsense, said George. George has always been a shade pig-headed. You can't drive him. I believe he had a secret idea that his wife worked the changes herself, and that it was all some morbid, hysterical plan of hers. Well, the fatal night came. Mrs. Pritchard locked her door as usual. She was very calm, in almost an exalted state of mind. The nurse was worried by her state and wanted to give her a stimulant, an injection of strychnine, but Mrs. Pritchard refused. In a way, I believe, she was enjoying herself. George said she was. I think that's quite possible, said Mrs. Bantry. There must have been a strange sort of glamour about the whole thing. There was no violent ringing of a bell the next morning. Mrs. Pritchard usually woke about 8. When at 8:30 there was no sign from her, Nurse rapped loudly on the door. Getting no reply, she fetched George and insisted on the door being broken open. They did so with the help of a chisel. One look at the still figure on the bed was enough for Nurse Copling. She sent George to telephone for the doctor, but it was too late. Mrs. Pritchard, he said, must have been dead at least 8 hours. Her smelling salts lay by her hand on the bed, and on the wall beside her, one of the pinky-red geraniums was a bright, deep blue. "Horrible," said Miss Helier with a shiver. Sir Henry was frowning. "No additional details?" Colonel Bantry shook his head, but Mrs. Bantry spoke quickly. "The gas." "What about the gas?" asked Sir Henry. "When the doctor arrived, there was a slight smell of gas, and sure enough he found the gas ring in the fireplace very slightly turned on, but so little that it couldn't have mattered." "Did Mr. Pritchard and the nurse not notice it when they first went in?" "The nurse said she did notice a slight smell. George said he didn't notice gas, but something made him feel very queer and overcome. But he put that down to shock, and probably it was. At any rate, there was no question of gas poisoning. The smell was scarcely noticeable." "And that's the end of the story?" "No, it isn't. One way and another, there was a lot of talk. The servants, you see, had overheard things. I'd heard, for instance, Mrs. Pritchard telling her husband that he hated her and would jeer if she were dying, and also more recent remarks. She said one day, apropos of his refusing to leave the house, "Very well, when I am dead, I hope everyone will realize that you have killed me." And as ill luck would have it, he'd been mixing some weed-killer for the garden paths the very day before. One of the younger servants had seen him, and had afterwards seen him taking up a glass of hot milk to his wife. The talk spread and grew. The doctor had given a certificate, I don't know exactly in what terms, shock, syncope, heart failure, probably some medical term meaning nothing much. However, the poor lady had not been a month in her grave before an exhumation order was applied for, and granted. And the result of the autopsy was nil, I remember, said Sir Henry gravely. A case, for once, of smoke without fire. The whole thing is really very curious, said Mrs. Bantry. That fortune-teller, for instance, Zarida, and the address where she was supposed to be. No one had ever heard of any such person. She appeared once, out of the blue, said our husband, and then utterly vanished. Out of the blue? Yes, that's rather good. And what is more, continued Mrs. Bantry, little Nurse Carstairs, who was supposed to have recommended her, had never even heard of her. They looked at each other. It's a mysterious story, said Dr. Lloyd. One can make guesses, but to guess... Oh, he shook his head. "Has Mr. Pritchard married Miss Instow?" asked Miss Marple in her gentle voice. "Now, why do you ask that?" inquired Sir Henry. Miss Marple opened gentle blue eyes. "It seems to me so important," she said. "Have they married?" Colonel Bantry shook his head. Well, we expected something of the kind, but it's 18 months now. I don't believe they even see much of each other." "That is important," said Miss Marple. "Very important." "Then you think the same as I do," said Mrs. Bantry. "You think—" "Now, Dolly," said her husband, "it is unjustifiable what you're going to say. You can't go about accusing people without a shadow of proof." "Don't be so manly, Arthur. Men are always afraid to say anything. Anyway, this is all between ourselves. It's just a wild, fantastic idea of mine that possibly, only possibly, Jean Instow disguised herself as a fortune-teller. Mind you, she might have done it for a joke. I don't for a minute think that she meant any harm, but if she did do it, and if Mrs. Pritchard was foolish enough to die of fright... Well, that's what Miss Marple meant, wasn't it?" "No, dear, not quite," said Miss Marple. "You see, if I were going to kill anyone, which of course I wouldn't dream of doing for a minute, because it would be very wicked, and besides I don't like killing, not even wasps, although I know it has to be, and I'm sure the gardener does it as humanely as possible. Now let me see, what was I saying?" "If you wish to kill anyone," prompted Sir Henry. "Oh, yes, well, if I did, I shouldn't be at all satisfied to trust to fright. I know one reads of people dying of it, but it seems a very uncertain sort of thing, and the most nervous people are far more brave than one really thinks they are. I should like something definite and certain, and make a thoroughly good plan about it." "Miss Marple," said Sir Henry, "you frighten me. I hope you'll never wish to remove me. Your plans would be too good." Miss Marple looked at him reproachfully. "I thought I'd made it clear that I would never contemplate such wickedness," she said. "No, I was trying to put myself in the place of a certain person." "Do you mean George Pritchard?" asked Colonel Bantry. "I'll never believe it of George, though, mind you, even the nurse believes it. I went and saw her about a month afterwards at the time of the exhumation. She didn't know how it was done. In fact, she wouldn't say anything at all, but it was clear enough that she believed George to be in some way responsible for his wife's death. She was convinced of it. "Well," said Dr. Lloyd, "perhaps she wasn't so far wrong, and mind you, a nurse often knows. She can't say, she's got no proof, but she knows." Sir Henry leant forward. "Come now, Miss Marple," he said persuasively, "you're lost in a daydream. Won't you tell us all about it?" Miss Marple started and turned pink. "Oh, I beg your pardon," she said. I was just thinking about our district nurse. This difficult problem. More difficult than the problem of a blue geranium?" "It really depends on the primroses," said Miss Marple. "I mean, Mrs. Bantry said they were yellow and pink. If it was a pink primrose that turned blue, of course that fits in perfectly. But if it happened to be a yellow one—" "It was a pink one," said Mrs. Bantry. She stared. They all stared at Miss Marple. "Then that seems to settle it," said Miss Marple. She shook her head regretfully. "And the wasp season and everything. And, of course, the gas." "It reminds you, I suppose, of countless village tragedies," said Sir Henry. "Not tragedies," said Miss Marple, "and certainly nothing criminal, but it does remind me a little of the trouble we are having with the district nurse. After all, nurses are human beings, and what with having to be so correct in their behaviour, and wearing those uncomfortable collars, and being so thrown with the family, well, can you wonder that things sometimes happen?" A glimmer of light broke upon Sir Henry. "You mean Nurse Carstairs?" "Oh, no, not Nurse Carstairs. Nurse Coupling. You see, she'd been there before and was very much thrown with Mr. Pritchard, who, you say, is an attractive man. I dare say she thought, poor thing, well, we needn't go into that. I don't suppose she knew about Miss Instow. And, of course, afterwards, when she found out, it turned her against him, and she tried to do all the harm she could. Of course, the letter really gave her away, didn't it?" "What letter?" "Well, she wrote to the fortune-teller at Mrs. Pritchard's request, and the fortune-teller came, apparently in answer to the letter. But later it was discovered that there never had been such a person at that address. So that shows that Nurse Coupling was in it. She only pretended to write. So what could be more likely than she was the fortune-teller herself?" "I never saw the point about the letter," said Sir Henry. "That's the most important point, of course." "Rather a bold step to take," said Miss Marple, "because Mrs. Pritchard might have recognized her in spite of the disguise, though, of course, if she had, the nurse could have pretended it was a joke." "What did you mean," said Sir Henry, "when you said that if you were a certain person you would not have trusted to fright?" "Oh, one couldn't be sure that way," said Miss Marple. "No, I think that the warnings and the blue flowers were, if I may use a military term," she laughed self-consciously, just camouflage." "And the real thing?" "I know," said Miss Marple apologetically, "that I've got wasps on the brain. Poor things, destroyed in their thousands, and usually on such a beautiful summer's day. But I remember thinking, when I saw the gardener shaking up the cyanide of potassium in a bottle with water, how like smelling salts it looked. And if it were put in a smelling salt bottle and substituted for the real one, well, the poor lady was in the habit of using her smelling salt. Indeed, you said they were found by her hand. Then, of course, while Mr. Pritchard went to telephone to the doctor, the nurse would change it for the real bottle, and she'd just turn on the gas a little to mask any smell of almonds, and in case anyone felt queer. And I always have heard that cyanide leaves no trace if you wait long enough. Of course, I may be wrong, and it may have been something entirely different in the bottle, but that doesn't really matter, does it?" Miss Marple paused, a little out of breath. Jane Helier leaned forward and said, "But the blue geranium and the other flowers?" nurses always have litmus paper, don't they, said Miss Marple, for testing. Not a very pleasant subject. We won't dwell on it. I've done a little nursing myself. She grew delicately pink. Blue turns red with acids, and red turns blue with alkalis. So easy to paste some red litmus over a red flower near the bed, of course. And then, when the poor lady used her smelling salts, the strong ammonia fumes would turn it blue. Really, most ingenious. Of course, the geranium wasn't blue when they first broke into the room. Nobody noticed it till afterwards. When Nurse changed the bottle, she held the sal ammoniac against the wallpaper for a minute, I expect. You might have been there, Miss Marple, said Sir Henry. What worries me, said Miss Marple, is poor Mr. Pritchard and that nice girl, Miss Instow, probably both suspecting each other and keeping apart, and life so very short. She shook her head. You needn't worry, said Sir Henry. As a matter of fact, I have something up my sleeve. A nurse has been arrested on a charge of murdering an elderly patient who had left her a legacy. It was done with cyanide of potassium, substituted for smelling salts. Nurse Copling trying the same trick again. Miss Instow and Mr. Pritchard need have no doubts as to the truth. "Now, isn't that nice?" cried Miss Marple. "I don't mean about the new murder, of course. That's very sad and shows how much wickedness there is in the world, and that if once you give way... Oh, which reminds me, I must finish my little conversation with you, Dr. Lloyd, about the village nurse." The four suspects. The conversation hovered round undiscovered and unpunished crimes. Everyone in turn vouchsafed their opinion. Colonel Bantry, his plump, amiable wife, Jane Hillier, Dr. Lloyd, and even old Miss Marple. The one person who did not speak was the one best fitted, in most people's opinion, to do so. Sir Henry Clithering, ex-Commissioner of Scotland Yard, sat silent, twisting his moustache, or rather stroking it, and half smiling, as though at some inward thought that amused him. "Sir Henry," said Mrs. Bantry at last, "if you don't say something I shall scream. Are there a lot of crimes that go unpunished, or are there not?" "You're thinking of newspaper headlines, Mrs. Bantry. Scotland Yard at fault again, and a list of unsolved mysteries to follow, which really, I suppose, form a very small percentage of the whole," said Dr. Lloyd. "Yes, that is so. The hundreds of crimes that are solved and the perpetrators punished are seldom held in song. But that isn't quite the point at issue, is it? When you talk of undiscovered crimes and unsolved crimes, you are talking of two different things. In the first category come all the crimes that Scotland Yard never hears about, the crimes that no one even knows have been committed." "But I suppose there aren't very many of those," said Mrs. Bantry. "Aren't there?" "Sir Henry, you don't mean there are?" "I should think," said Miss Marple thoughtfully, "that there must be a very large number." The charming old lady with her old-world unruffled air made her statement in a tone of the utmost placidity. "My dear Miss Marple," said Colonel Bantry. "Of course," said Miss Marple, "a lot of people are stupid, and stupid people get found out, whatever they do. But there are quite a number of people who aren't stupid, and one shudders to think of what they might accomplish unless they had very strongly rooted principles." "Yes," said Sir Henry, "there are a lot of people who aren't stupid. How often does some crime come to light simply by reason of a bit of unmitigated bungling, and each time one asks oneself the question, if this hadn't been bungled, would anybody ever have known?" "But that's very serious, Clythering," said Colonel Bantry. "Very serious indeed." "Is it?" "What do you mean, is it? Of course it's serious. You say crime goes unpunished, but does it? Unpunished by the law, perhaps, but cause and effect work outside the law. To say that every crime brings its own punishment is by way of being a platitude, and yet, in my opinion, nothing can be truer." "Perhaps," said Colonel Bantry, "but that doesn't alter the seriousness, the seriousness." He paused, rather at a loss. Sir Henry Clythering smiled. 99 people out of 100 are doubtless of your way of thinking," he said, "but you know, it isn't really guilt that's important. It's innocence. That's the thing that nobody will realize." "I don't understand," said Jane Hillier. "I do," said Miss Marple. "When Mrs. Trent found £5 missing from her bag, the person it affected most was the Daily Woman, Mrs. Arthur. Of course the Trents thought it was her, but being kindly people, and knowing that she had a large family and a husband who drinks, well, they naturally didn't want to go to extremes, but they felt differently towards her, and they didn't leave her in charge of the house when they went away, which made a great difference to her, and other people began to get a feeling about her too. And then it suddenly came out that it was the governess. Mrs. Trent saw her through a door reflected in a mirror. The purest chance, though I prefer to call it providence. And that, I think, is what Sir Henry means. Most people would be only interested in who took the money, and it turned out to be the most unlikely person, just like in detective stories. But the real person it was life and death to was poor Mrs. Arthur, who had done nothing. That's what you mean, isn't it, Sir Henry?" "Yes, Miss Marple, you've hit off my meaning exactly. Your charwoman person was lucky in the instance you relate. Her innocence was shown, but some people may go through a lifetime crushed by the weight of a suspicion that is really unjustified." "Are you thinking of some particular instance, Sir Henry?" asked Mrs. Bantry shrewdly. "As a matter of fact, Mrs. Bantry, I am. A very curious case. A case where we believe murder to have been committed, but with no possible chance of ever proving it." "Poison, I suppose," breathed Jane. "Something untraceable." Dr. Lloyd moved restlessly, and Sir Henry shook his head. "No, dear lady, not the secret arrow poison of the South American Indians. I wish it were something of that kind. We have to deal with something much more prosaic, so prosaic, in fact, that there is no hope of bringing the deed home to its perpetrator. An old gentleman who fell downstairs and broke his neck. One of those regrettable accidents which happen every day. But what happened, really? Who can say?" Sir Henry shrugged his shoulders. "A push from behind? Piece of cotton or string tied across the top of the stairs and carefully removed afterwards? That we shall never know." "But you do think that it, wasn't an accident? Now why?" asked the doctor. "That's rather a long story, but, yes, we're pretty sure. As I said, there's no chance of being able to bring the deed home to anyone. The evidence would be too flimsy. But there's the other aspect of the case, the one I was speaking about. You see, there were 4 people who might have done the trick. One's guilty, but the other 3 are innocent. And unless the truth is found out, those 3 are going to remain under the terrible shadow of doubt. "I think," said Mrs. Bantry, "that you'd better tell us your long story." "Well, I needn't make it so very long, after all," said Sir Henry. "I can at any rate condense the beginning. That deals with the German secret society, the Schwarzhand, something after the lines of the Camorra, or what is most people's idea of the Camorra. a scheme of blackmail and terrorization. The thing started quite suddenly after the war and spread to an amazing extent. Numberless people were victimized by it. The authorities were not successful in coping with it, for its secrets were jealously guarded, and it was almost impossible to find anyone who could be induced to betray them. Nothing much was ever known about it in England, but in Germany it was having a most paralyzing effect. It was finally broken up and dispersed through the efforts of one man, a Dr. Rosen, who had at one time been very prominent in Secret Service work. He became a member, penetrated its inmost circle, and was, as I say, instrumental in bringing about its downfall. But he was, in consequence, a marked man, and it was deemed wise that he should leave Germany, at any rate for a time. He came to England, and we had letters about him from the police in Berlin. He came and had a personal interview with me. His point of view was both dispassionate and resigned. He had no doubts of what the future held for him. "They'll get me, Sir Henry," he said, "not a doubt of it." He was a big man with a fine head and a very deep voice, with only a slight guttural intonation to tell of his nationality. "That is a foregone conclusion." "Does not matter. I am prepared. I faced the risk when I undertook this business. I have done what I set out to do. The organization can never be gotten together again, but there are members of it at liberty, and they will take the only revenge they can. My life. It is simply a question of time, but I am anxious that that time should be as long as possible. You see, I'm collecting and editing some very interesting material, the result of my life's work. I should like, if possible, to be able to complete my task." He spoke very simply, with a certain grandeur which I could not but admire. I told him we would take all precautions, but he waved my words aside. "Some day, sooner or later, they will get me," he repeated. "When that day comes, do not distress yourself. You will, I have no doubt, have done all that is possible." He then proceeded to outline his plans, which were simple enough. He proposed to take a small cottage in the country where he could live quietly and go on with his work. In the end, he selected a village in Somerset, Kingsnayton, which was 7 miles from a railway station and singularly untouched by civilization. He bought a very charming cottage, had various improvements and alterations made, and settled down there most contentedly. His household consisted of his niece Greta, a secretary, an old German servant who had served him faithfully for nearly 40 years, and an outside handyman and gardener who was a native of Kingsnayton. "The 4 suspects," said Dr. Lloyd softly. "Exactly, the 4 suspects. There's not much more to tell. Life went on peacefully at Kingsnayton for 5 months, and then the blow fell. Dr. Rosen fell down the stairs one morning and was found dead about half an hour later. At the time the accident must have taken place, Gertrude was in her kitchen with the door closed and heard nothing, so she says. Fräulein Greta was in the garden planting some bulbs. Again, so she says. The gardener Dobbs was in the small potting shed having his elevenses, so he says, and the secretary was out for a walk, and once more there is only his word for it. No one had an alibi. No one can corroborate anyone else's story, but one thing is certain. No one from outside could have done it, for a stranger in the little village of Kingsnayton would be noticed without fail. Both the back and the front doors were locked, each member of the household having their own key. So you see it narrows down to those 4, and yet each one seems to be above suspicion. Greta, his own brother's child, Gertrude, with 40 years of faithful service, Dobbs, who had never been out of King's Nathan, and Charles Templeton, the secretary. "Yes," said Colonel Bantry, "what about him? He seems a suspicious person to my mind. What do you know about him?" "It is what I knew about him that put him completely out of court. At any rate at the time," said Sir Henry gravely. "You see, Charles Templeton was one of my own men." "Oh," said Colonel Bantry, considerably taken aback. "Yes, I wanted to have someone on the spot, and at the same time I didn't want to cause talk in the village. Rosen really needed a secretary. I put Templeton on the job. He's a gentleman, he speaks German fluently, and he's altogether a very able fellow." "But then, which do you suspect?" asked Mrs. Bantry in a bewildered tone. "They all seem so, well, impossible." "Yes, so it appears. But you can look at the thing from another angle. Fräulein Greta was his niece and a very lovely girl, but the war has shown us time and again that brother can turn against sister, or father against son, and so on, and the loveliest and gentlest of young girls did some of the most amazing things. The same applies to Gertrude, and who knows what other forces might be at work in her case. A quarrel, perhaps, with her master, a growing resentment, all the more lasting because of the long faithful years behind her. Elderly women of that class can be amazingly bitter sometimes. And Dobbs, was he right outside it because he had no connection with the family? Money will do much. In some ways Dobbs might have been approached and bought. For one thing seems certain. Some message or some order must have come from outside. Otherwise, why 5 months' immunity? No, the agents of the society must have been at work. Not yet sure of Rosen's perfidy, they delayed till the betrayal had been traced to him beyond any possible doubt. And then, all doubts set aside, they must have sent their message to the spy within the gates, the message that said, "Kill." "How nasty," said Jane Hillier, and shuddered. But how did the message come? That was the point I tried to elucidate. The one hope of solving my problem. One of those 4 people must have been approached or communicated with in some way. There would be no delay. I knew that as soon as the command came it would be carried out. That was a peculiarity of the Schwartz Hand. I went into the question, went into it in a way that will probably strike you as being ridiculously meticulous. Who had come to the cottage that morning? I eliminated nobody. Here's the list. He took an envelope from his pocket and selected a paper from its contents. The butcher, bringing some neck of mutton, investigated and found correct. The grocer's assistant, bringing a packet of corn flour, 2 pounds of sugar, a pound of butter, and a pound of coffee, also investigated and found correct. The postman, bringing 2 circulars for Fräulein Rosen, a local letter for Gertrude, 3 letters for Dr. Rosen, 1 with a foreign stamp, and 2 letters for Mr. Templeton, 1 also with a foreign stamp. Sir Henry paused and then took a sheaf of documents from the envelope. "It may interest you to see these for yourself. They were handed me by the various people concerned or collected from the wastepaper basket. I need hardly say they've been tested by experts for invisible ink, etc. No excitement of that kind is possible." Everyone crowded round to look. The catalogues were respectively from a nurseryman and from a prominent London fur establishment. The 2 bills addressed to Dr. Rosen were a local one for seeds for the garden and one from a London stationery firm. The latter, addressed to him, ran as follows. "My dear Rosen, just back from Dr. Helmut Spath's. I saw Edgar Jackson the other day. He and Amos Perry have just come back from Tsingtao. In all honesty, I can't say I envy them the trip. Let me have news of you soon. As I said before, beware of a certain person. You know who I mean, though you don't agree. Yours, Georgina. Mr. Templeton's mail consisted of this bill, which as you see is an account rendered from his tailor, and a letter from a friend in Germany, went on Sir Henry. The latter, unfortunately, he tore up whilst out on his walk. Finally, we have the letter received by Gertrude. Dear Mrs. Schwartz, we are hoping as how you'll be able to come to the social on Friday evening. The vicar says as he hopes you will, one and all being welcome. The recipe for the ham was very good, and I thanks you for it. Hoping as this finds you well, and that we shall see you Friday, I remain, yours faithfully, Emma Green. Dr. Lloyd smiled a little over this, and so did Mrs. Bantry. I think the last letter can be put out of court, said Dr. Lloyd. I thought the same, said Sir Henry, but I took the precaution of verifying that there was a Mrs. Green at the church social. One can't be too careful, you know. That's what our friend Miss Marple always says, said Dr. Lloyd, smiling. You're lost in a daydream, Miss Marple. What are you thinking out? Miss Marple gave a start. Oh, so stupid of me, she said. I was just wondering why the word honesty in Dr. Rosen's letter was spelt with a capital H. Mrs. Bantry picked it up. So it is, she said. Oh. Yes, dear, said Miss Marple. I thought you'd notice. There's a definite warning in that letter, said Colonel Bantry. That's the first thing that caught my attention. I noticed more than you think. Yes, a definite warning. Against whom? There is rather a curious point about that letter, said Sir Henry. According to Templeton, Dr. Rosen opened the letter at breakfast and tossed it across to him, saying he didn't know who the fellow was from Adam. But it wasn't a fellow, said Jane Hellier. It was signed Georgina. It's difficult to say which it is, said Dr. Lloyd. It might be Georgie, but it certainly looks more like Georgina. Only it strikes me that the writing is a man's. You know, that's interesting, said Colonel Bantry, his tossing it across the table like that and pretending he knew nothing about it. Wanted to watch somebody's face. Whose face? The girl's or the man's? Or even the cook's, suggested Mrs. Bantry. She might have been in the room bringing in the breakfast, but what I don't see is... it's most peculiar. She frowned over the letter. Miss Marple drew closer to her. Miss Marple's finger went out and touched the sheet of paper. They murmured together. "But why did the secretary tear up the other letter?" asked Jane Hellier suddenly. "It seems... oh, I don't know. It seems queer. Why should he have letters from Germany? Although, of course, if he's above suspicion, as you say... But Sir Henry didn't say that, said Miss Marple, quickly looking up from her murmured conference with Mrs. Bantry. He said 4 suspects. So that shows that he includes Mr. Templeton. I'm right, am I not, Sir Henry? Yes, Miss Marple, I've learned one thing through bitter experience. Never say to yourself that anyone is above suspicion. I gave you reasons just now why 3 of these people might, after all, be guilty, unlikely as it seemed. I did not at that time apply the same process to Charles Templeton, but I came to it at last through pursuing the rule I have just mentioned, and I was forced to recognize this, that every army and every navy and every police force has a certain number of traitors within its ranks, much as we hate to admit the idea, and I examined dispassionately the case against Charles Templeton. I asked myself very much the same questions as Miss Hellier has just asked. Why should he alone of all the house not be able to produce the letter he had received? A letter, moreover, with a German stamp on it. Why should he have letters from Germany? The last question was an innocent one, and I actually put it to him. His reply came simply enough. His mother's sister was married to a German. The letter had been from a German girl cousin. So I learned something I did not know before, that Charles Templeton had relations with people in Germany. And that put him definitely on the list of suspects. Very much so. He is my own man, a lad I've always liked and trusted, but in common justice and fairness, I must admit that he heads that list. But there it is. I do not know. I do not know. And in all probability, I never shall know. It's not a question of punishing a murderer. It's a question that seems to me 100 times more important. It is the blighting, perhaps, of an honourable man's whole career, because of suspicion, a suspicion that I dare not disregard. Miss Marple coughed and said gently, then, Sir Henry, if I understand you rightly, it is this young Mr. Templeton only who is so much on your mind. Yes, in a sense. It should, in theory, be the same for all four, but that is not actually the case. Dobbs, for instance, suspicion may attach to him in my mind, but it will not actually affect his career. Nobody in the village has ever had any idea that old Dr. Rosen's death was anything but an accident. Gertrude is slightly more affected, must make, for instance, a difference in Fräulein Rosen's attitude towards her, but that possibly is not of great importance to her. As for Greta Rosen, well, here we come to the crux of the matter. Greta is a very pretty girl, and Charles Templeton is a good-looking young man, and for 5 months they were thrown together with no outer distractions. The inevitable happened. They fell in love with each other, even if they did not come to the point of admitting the fact in words. And then the catastrophe happens. It is 3 months ago now, and a day or two after I returned, that Greta Rosen came to see me. She had sold the cottage and was returning to Germany, having finally settled up her uncle's affairs. She came to me personally, although she knew I had retired, because it was really about a personal matter she wanted to see me. She beat about the bush a little, but at last it all came out. What did I think? That letter with the German stamp. She had worried about it and worried about it, the one Charles had torn up. Was it all right? Surely it must be all right. Of course she believed his story, but oh, if she only knew, if she knew for certain. You see? The same feeling, the wish to trust, but the horrible lurking suspicion thrust resolutely to the back of her mind, but persisting nevertheless. I spoke to her with absolute frankness and asked her to do the same. I asked her whether she'd been on the point of caring for Charles and he for her. "I think so," she said. "Oh, yes, I know it was so. We were so happy. Every day passed so contentedly. We knew, we both knew. There was no hurry. There was all the time in the world. Some day he would tell me that he loved me, and I should tell him that I, too. Ah, but you can guess. And now it is all changed. A black cloud has come between us. We are constrained when we meet. We do not know what to say. It's perhaps the same with him as with me. We are each saying to ourselves, if I were sure. That is why, Sir Henry, I beg of you to say to me, you may be sure whoever killed your uncle, it was not Charles Templeton. Say it to me. Oh, say it to me, I beg, I beg. And damn it all, cried Sir Henry, bringing down his fist with a bang on the table, I couldn't say it to her. They'll drift farther and farther apart, those two, with suspicion like a ghost between them. A ghost that can't be laid. He leant back in his chair. His face looked tired and grey. He shook his head once or twice despondently. There's nothing more that can be done unless... He sat up straight again, and a tiny whimsical smile crossed his face. Unless Miss Marple can help us. Can't you, Miss Marple? I've a feeling that letter might be in your line, you know, the one about the church social. Doesn't it remind you of something or someone that makes everything perfectly plain? Can't you do something to help two helpless young people who want to be happy? Behind the whimsicality there was something earnest in his appeal. He had come to think very highly of the mental powers of this frail, old-fashioned maiden lady. He looked across at her with something very like hope in his eyes. Miss Marple coughed and smoothed her lace. "Well, it does remind me a little of Annie Pulteney," she admitted. "Of course the letter is perfectly plain, both to Mrs. Bantry and myself. I don't mean the church social letter, but the other one. You living so much in London and not being a gardener, Sir Henry, would not have been likely to notice." "Eh?" said Sir Henry. "Notice what?" Mrs. Bantry reached out a hand and selected a catalogue. She opened it and read aloud with gusto, "Dr. Helmut's Spur. Pure lilac, a wonderful fine flower, carried on exceptionally long and stiff stem, splendid for cutting and garden decoration, a novelty of striking beauty. Edgar Jackson, beautifully shaped chrysanthemum-like flower of a distinct brick red colour. Amos Perry, brilliant red, highly decorative. Tsingtao, brilliant orange-red, showy garden plant, and lasting cut flower. Honesty," with a capital H, you remember, murmured Miss Marple. "Honesty, rose and white shades, enormous, perfect-shaped flower." Mrs. Bantry flung down the catalogue and said with immense explosive force, "Dahlias." "And their initial letters spell death," explained Miss Marple. "But the letter came to Dr. Rosen himself," objected Sir Henry. "That was the clever part of it," said Miss Marple. "That and the warning in it. What would he do, getting a letter from someone he didn't know, full of names he didn't know? Why, of course, toss it over to his secretary." "Then after all—" "Oh, no," said Miss Marple, "not the secretary. Why, that's what makes it so perfectly clear that it wasn't him. He'd never have let that letter be found if so. And equally he'd never have destroyed a letter to himself with a German stamp on it. Really, his innocence is, if you'll allow me to use the word, just shining." "Then who—" "Well, it seems almost certain as anything can be in this world. There was another person at the breakfast table, and she would, quite naturally, under the circumstances, put out her hand for the letter and read it. And that would be that. You remember that she got a gardening catalogue by the same post." "Greta Rosen," said Sir Henry slowly. "Then her visit to me—" "Gentlemen never see through these things," said Miss Marple, "and I'm afraid they often think we old women are, well, cats to see the things the way we do, but there it is. One does know a great deal about one's sex. Unfortunately, I've no doubt there was a barrier between them. The young man felt a sudden, inexplicable repulsion. He suspected purely through instinct, and couldn't hide the suspicion. And I really think that the girl's visit to you was just pure spite. She was safe enough, really, but she just went out of her way to fix your suspicions definitely on poor Mr. Templeton. You weren't nearly so sure about him until after her visit." "I'm sure it was nothing that she said," began Sir Henry. "Gentlemen," said Miss Marple calmly, "never see through these things." And that girl—" He stopped. "She commits a cold-blooded murder and gets off scot-free." "Oh, no, Sir Henry," said Miss Marple, "not scot-free. Neither you nor I believe that. Remember what you said not long ago. No, Greta Rosen will not escape punishment. To begin with, she must be in with a very queer set of people. Blackmailers, terrorists, associates who will do her no good and will probably bring her to a miserable end. As you say, one mustn't waste thoughts on the guilty. It's the innocent who matter. Mr. Templeton, who I dare say will marry the German cousin, his tearing up her letter looks— well, it looks suspicious, using the word in quite a different sense from the one we've been using all the evening. As little as though he were afraid of the other girl noticing or asking to see it. Yes, I think there must have been some little romance there. And then there's Dobbs. Though, as you say, I dare say it won't much matter to him. His 11ths are probably all he thinks about. And then there's that poor old Gertrude, the one who reminded me of Annie Pulteney. Poor Annie Pulteney. 50 years' faithful service, and suspected of making away with Miss Lamb's will, though nothing could be proved. Almost broke the poor creature's faithful heart, and then after she was dead it came to light in the secret drawer of the tea-caddy where old Miss Lamb had put it herself for safety. But it was too late then for poor Annie. That's what worries me so about that poor old German woman. When one is old, one becomes embittered very easily. I felt much more sorry for her than for Mr. Templeton, who is young and good-looking and evidently a favourite with the ladies. You will write to her, won't you, Sir Henry, and just tell her that her innocence is established beyond doubt. Her dear old master dead, and she no doubt brooding and feeling herself suspected of— oh, dear, it won't bear thinking about. I will write, Miss Marple, said Sir Henry. He looked at her curiously. You know, I shall never quite understand you. Your outlook is always a different one from what I expect. My outlook, I'm afraid, is a very petty one, said Miss Marple humbly. I hardly ever go out of St. Mary Mead. And yet you have solved what may be called an international mystery, said Sir Henry. For you have solved it. I'm convinced of that. Miss Marple blushed, then bridled a little. I was, I think, well educated with the standard of my day. My sister and I had a German governess, a Fräulein. Very sentimental creature. She taught us the language of flowers, a forgotten study nowadays, but most charming. Now, a yellow tulip, for instance, means hopeless love, while a China aster means I die of jealousy at your feet. That letter was signed Georgina, which I seem to remember is Dahlia in German, and of course that made the whole thing perfectly clear. Wish I could remember the meaning of Dahlia, but alas, that eludes me. My memory is not what it was. At any rate, it didn't mean death. Oh, no, indeed. Horrible, is it not? Very sad things in the world. Oh, there are, said Mrs. Banshee with a sigh. It's lucky one has flowers and one's friends. She puts us last, you observe, said Dr. Lloyd. A man used to send me purple orchids every night to the theatre, said Jane Helier dreamily. I await your favours. That's what that means, said Miss Marple brightly. Sir Henry gave a peculiar sort of cough and turned his head away. Miss Marple gave a sudden exclamation. I've remembered. Dahlia means treachery and misrepresentation. Wonderful, said Sir Henry. Absolutely wonderful. And he sighed. The companion. Now, Dr. Lloyd, said Miss Helier, don't you know any creepy stories? She smiled at him. the smile that nightly bewitched the theatre-going public. Jane Helier was sometimes called the most beautiful woman in England, and jealous members of her own profession were in the habit of saying to each other, "Of course, Jane's not an artist. She can't act, if you know what I mean. It's those eyes." And those eyes were at this minute fixed appealingly on the grizzled, elderly bachelor doctor, who for the last 5 years had ministered to the ailments of the village of St. Mary Mead. With an unconscious gesture, the doctor pulled down his waistcoat, inclined of late to be uncomfortably tight, and racked his brains hastily so as not to disappoint the lovely creature who addressed him so confidently. "I feel," said Jane dreamily, "that I would like to wallow in crime this evening." "Splendid," said Colonel Bantry, her host. "Splendid, splendid." And he laughed a loud, hearty military laugh. "Eh, Dolly?" His wife hastily recalled to the exigencies of social life. She had been planning her spring boarder, agreed enthusiastically. "Of course it's splendid," she said heartily but vaguely. "I always thought so." "Did you, my dear?" said old Miss Marple, and her eyes twinkled a little. "We don't get much in the creepy line, and still less in the criminal line in St. Mary Mead, you know, Miss Helier," said Dr. Lloyd. "You surprise me," said Sir Henry Clythering. The ex-commissioner of Scotland Yard turned to Miss Marple. "I always understood from our friend here that St. Mary Mead is a positive hotbed of crime and vice." "Oh, Sir Henry," protested Miss Marple, a spot of colour coming into her cheeks, "I'm sure I never said anything of the kind. The only thing I ever said was that human nature is much the same in a village as anywhere else, only one has opportunities and leisure for seeing it at closer quarters." "But you haven't always lived here," said Jane Helier, still addressing the doctor. "You've been in all sorts of queer places all over the world, places where things happen." "That is so, of course," said Dr. Lloyd, still thinking desperately. "Yes, of course." "Yes, now I have it." She sank back with a sigh of relief. "It's some years ago now. I'd almost forgotten, but the facts were really very strange indeed. And the final coincidence which put the clue into my hand was strange also." Miss Helier drew her chair a little nearer to him, applied some lipstick, and waited expectantly. The others also turned interested faces towards him. "I don't know whether any of you know the Canary Islands," began the doctor. "Oh, they must be wonderful," said Jane Helier. "They're in the South Seas, aren't they? Or is it in the Mediterranean?" "I've called in there on my way to South Africa," said the Colonel. "The Peak of Tenerife is a fine sight with the setting sun on it." "The incident I'm describing happened in the island of Gran Canaria, not Tenerife. It's a good many years ago now. I had had a breakdown in health and was forced to give up my practice in England to go abroad. I practiced in Las Palmas, which is the principal town of Gran Canaria. In many ways I enjoyed the life out there very much. The climate was mild and sunny, there was excellent surf bathing, and I am an enthusiastic bather, and the sea life of the port attracted me. Ships from all over the world put in at Las Palmas. I used to walk along the mole every morning, far more interested than any member of the fair sex could be in a street of hat shops. As I say, ships from all over the world put in at Las Palmas. Sometimes they stayed a few hours, sometimes a day or two. In the principal hotel there, the Metropole, you'll see people of all races and nationalities. Birds of passage. Even the people going to Tenerife usually come here and stay a few days before crossing to the other island. My story begins there, in the Metropole Hotel, one Thursday evening in January. There was a dance going on, and I and my friend had been sitting at a small table watching the scene. There were a fair sprinkling of English and other nationalities, but the majority of the dancers were Spanish. And when the orchestra struck up a tango, only half a dozen couples of the latter nationality took the floor. They all danced well, and we looked on and admired. One woman in particular excited our lively admiration. Tall, beautiful, and sinuous, she moved with the grace of a half-tamed leopardess. There was something dangerous about her. I said as much to my friend, and he agreed. Women like that, he said, are bound to have a history. Life will not pass them by. Beauty is perhaps a dangerous possession, I said. It's not only beauty, he insisted, there's something else. Now look at her again. Things are bound to happen to that woman, or because of her. As I said, life will not pass her by. Strange and exciting events will surround her. You've only got to look at her to know it. He paused and then added with a smile, just as you've only got to look at those two women over there and to know nothing out of the way could ever happen to either of them. They're made for a safe and uneventful existence. I followed his eyes. The two women he referred to were travellers who had just arrived. A Holland Lloyd boat had put into port that evening, and the passengers were just beginning to arrive. As I looked at them, I saw at once what my friend meant. They were two English ladies, the thoroughly nice travelling English that you do find abroad. Their ages, I should say, were round about 40. One was fair and a little, just a little, too plump. The other was dark and a little, again, just a little, inclined to scragginess. They were what is called well-preserved, quietly and inconspicuously dressed in well-cut tweeds, and innocent of any kind of make-up. They had that air of quiet assurance which is the birthright of well-bred Englishwomen. There was nothing remarkable about either of them. They were like thousands of their sisters. They would doubtless see what they wished to see, assisted by Baedeker, and be blind to everything else. They would use the English library and attend the English church in any place they happened to be, and it was quite likely that one or both of them sketched a little. And as my friend said, nothing exciting or remarkable would ever happen to either of them, though they might quite likely travel half over the world. I looked from them back to our sinuous Spanish woman, with her half-closed, smouldering eyes, and I smiled. "Poor thing," said Jane Hellier with a sigh, "but I do think it's so silly of people not to make the most of themselves. That woman in Bond Street, Valentine, is really wonderful. Audrey Denman goes to her. Have you seen her in The Downward Step? As a schoolgirl in the first act, she's really marvellous. And yet Audrey is 50 if she's a day, and as a matter of fact, I happen to know she's really nearer 60. "Go on," said Mrs. Bantry to Dr. Lloyd. "I love stories about sinuous Spanish dancers. It makes me forget how old and fat I am." "I'm sorry," said Dr. Lloyd apologetically, "but you see, as a matter of fact, this story isn't about the Spanish woman." "Isn't?" "No. As it happens, my friend and I were wrong. Nothing in the least exciting happened to the Spanish beauty. She married a clerk in a shipping office, and by the time I left the island she had 5 children and was getting very fat." "Just like that girl of Israel Peters," commented Miss Marple, "the one who went on the stage and had such good legs that they made her principal boy in the pantomime. Everyone said she'd come to no good, but she married a commercial traveller and settled down splendidly." "The Village Parallel," murmured Sir Henry softly. "No," went on the doctor, "my story is about the 2 English ladies." "Something happened to them," breathed Miss Hellier. "Something happened to them, and the very next day, too." "Yes," said Mrs. Bantry encouragingly. "Just for curiosity, as I went out that evening, I glanced at the hotel register. I found the names easily enough. Miss Mary Barton and Miss Amy Durrant of Little Paddocks, Corton Weir, Bucks. I little thought then how soon I was to encounter the owner of those names again, and under what tragic circumstances. The following day I had arranged to go for a picnic with some friends. We were to motor across the island, taking our lunch to a place called, as far as I remember, it's so long ago, Las Nieves, a well-sheltered bay where we could bathe if we felt inclined. This programme we duly carried out, except that we were somewhat late in starting, so that we stopped on the way and picnicked, going on to Las Nieves afterwards for a bathe before tea. As we approached the beach, we were at once aware of a tremendous commotion. The whole population of the small village seemed to be gathered on the shore. As soon as they saw us, they rushed towards the car and began explaining excitedly. My Spanish not being very good, it took me a few minutes to understand, but at last I got it. 2 of the mad English ladies had gone in to bathe, and one had swum out too far and got into difficulties. The other had gone after her and had tried to bring her in, but her strength in turn had failed, and she too would have been drowned had not a man rowed out in a boat and brought in rescuer and rescued, the latter beyond help. As soon as I got the hang of things, I pushed the crowd aside and hurried down to the beach. I did not at first recognize the 2 women. The plump figure in the black stockinette costume and the tight green rubber bathing cap awoke no chord of recognition as she looked up anxiously. She was kneeling beside the body of her friend, making somewhat amateurish attempts at artificial respiration. When I told her that I was a doctor, she gave a sigh of relief, and I ordered her off at once to one of the cottages for a rub-down and dry clothing. One of the ladies in my party went with her. I myself worked unavailingly on the body of the drowned woman in vain. Life was only too clearly extinct, and in the end I had reluctantly to give in. I rejoined the others in the small fisherman's cottage, and there I had to break the sad news. The survivor was attired now in her own clothes, and I immediately recognized her as one of the 2 arrivals of the night before. She received the sad news fairly calmly, and it was evidently the horror of the whole thing that struck her more than any great personal feeling. "Poor Amy," she said. "Poor, poor Amy. She'd been looking forward to the bathing here so much, and she was a good swimmer, too. I can't understand it. What do you think it can have been, Doctor?" "Possibly cramp. Will you tell me exactly what happened?" "We had both been swimming about for some time, 20 minutes, I should say. Then I thought I would go in, but Amy said she was going to swim out once more. She did so, and suddenly I heard her call and realized that she was crying for help. I swam out as fast as I could. She was still afloat when I got to her, but she clutched me wildly, and we both went under. If it hadn't been for that man coming out with his boat, I should have been drowned too." "That has happened fairly often," I said. "To save anyone from drowning is not an easy affair." "Seems so awful," continued Miss Barton. "We only arrived yesterday. We were so delighting in the sunshine and our little holiday, and now this terrible tragedy occurs." I asked her then for particulars about the dead woman, explaining that I would do everything I could for her, but that the Spanish authorities would require full information. This she gave me readily enough. The dead woman, Miss Amy Durrant, was her companion, and had come to her about 5 months previously. They had got on very well together, but Miss Durrant had spoken very little about her people. She had been left an orphan at an early age, and had been brought up by an uncle, and had earned her own living since she was 21. "And so that was that," went on the doctor. He paused and said again, but this time with a certain finality in his voice, "And so that was that." "I don't understand," said Jane Helier. "Is that all?" "I mean, it's very tragic, and I suppose, but it isn't what I call creepy. I think there's more to follow, said Sir Henry. Yes, said Dr. Lloyd, there's more to follow. You see, right at the time there was one queer thing. Of course, I asked questions of the fishermen, etc., as to what they'd seen. They were eyewitnesses. And one woman had rather a funny story. I didn't pay any attention to it at the time, but it came back to me afterwards. She insisted, you see, that Miss Durrant wasn't in difficulties when she called out. The other swam out to her, and according to this woman, deliberately held Miss Durrant's head under water. I didn't, as I say, pay much attention. It was such a fantastic story, and these things look so differently from the shore. Miss Barton might have tried to make her friend lose consciousness, realizing that the latter's panic-stricken clutching would drown them both. You see, according to the Spanish woman's story, it looked as though Miss Barton was deliberately trying to drown her companion. As I say, I paid very little attention to this story at the time. It came back to me later. Our great difficulty was to find out anything about this woman, Amy Durrant. She didn't seem to have any relations. Miss Barton and I went through her things together. We found one address and wrote there, but it proved to be simply a room that she had taken in which to keep some of her things. The landlady knew nothing, had only seen her when she took the room. Miss Durrant had remarked at the time that she always liked to have one place she could call her own, to which she could return at any moment. There were one or two nice pieces of old furniture, and some bound numbers of Academy pictures, and a trunk full of pieces of material bought at sales, but no personal belongings. She had mentioned to the landlady that her father and mother had died in India when she was a child, and that she had been brought up by an uncle who was a clergyman. But she did not say if he was her father's or her mother's brother, so the name was no guide. It wasn't exactly mysterious. It was just unsatisfactory. There must be many lonely women, proud and reticent, in just that position. There were a couple of old photographs amongst her belongings in Las Palmas, rather old and faded, and they had been cut to fit the frames they were in, so that there was no photographer's name on them. And there was an old daguerreotype which might have been her mother, or more probably her grandmother. Miss Barton had had two references with her. One she had forgotten, the other name she recollected after an effort. It proved to be that of a lady who was now abroad, having gone to Australia. She was written to. Her answer, of course, was a long time in coming, and I may say that when it did arrive there was no particular help to be gained from it. She said Miss Durrant had been with her as companion, and had been most efficient, and that she was a very charming woman, but that she knew nothing of her private affairs or relations. So there it was. As I say, nothing unusual, really. It was just the two things together that aroused my uneasiness. This Amy Durrant, of whom no one knew anything, and the Spanish woman's queer story. Yes, and I'll add a third thing. When I was first bending over the body and Miss Barton was walking away towards the huts, she looked back with an expression on her face that I can only describe as one of poignant anxiety, the kind of anguished uncertainty that imprinted itself on my brain. It didn't strike me as anything unusual at the time. I put it down to her terrible distress over her friend. But you see, later, I realized that they weren't on those terms. There was no devoted attachment between them, no terrible grief. Miss Barton was fond of Amy Durrant and was shocked by her death. But that was all. But then, why that terrible, poignant anxiety? That was the question that kept coming back to me. I had not been mistaken in that look, and almost against my will an answer began to shape itself in my mind. Supposing the Spanish woman's story were true, supposing that Mary Barton wilfully and in cold blood tried to drown Amy Durrant. She succeeds in holding her under water while pretending to be saving her. She is rescued by a boat. They are on a lonely beach far from anywhere, and then I appear, the last thing she expects, a doctor, and an English doctor. She knows well enough that people who have been under water far longer than Amy Durrant have been revived by artificial respiration, but she has to play her part, to go off leaving me alone with her victim. And as she turns for one last look, a terrible, poignant anxiety shows in her face. Will Amy Durrant come back to life and tell what she knows? "Oh," said Jane Hillier, "I'm thrilled now." Viewed in that aspect, the whole business seemed more sinister, and the personality of Amy Durrant became more mysterious. Who was Amy Durrant? Why should she, an insignificant paid companion, be murdered by her employer? What story lay behind that fatal bathing expedition? She had entered Mary Barton's employment only a few months before. Mary Barton had brought her abroad, and the very day after they landed, the tragedy had occurred. And they were both nice, commonplace, refined Englishwomen. The whole thing was fantastic, and I told myself so. I had been letting my imagination run away with me. "You didn't do anything, then?" asked Miss Hillier. "My dear young lady, what could I do? There was no evidence. The majority of the eyewitnesses told the same story as Miss Barton. I had built up my own suspicions out of a fleeting expression which I might quite possibly have imagined. The only thing I could do and did do was to see that the widest inquiries were made for the relations of Amy Durrant. The next time I was in England, I even went and saw the landlady of her room, with the results I've told you." "But you felt there was something wrong," said Miss Marple. Dr. Lloyd nodded. "Half the time I was ashamed of myself for thinking so. Who was I to go suspecting this nice, pleasant-mannered English lady of a foul and cold-blooded crime? I did my best to be as cordial as possible to her during the short time she stayed on the island. I helped her with the Spanish authorities. I did everything I could do as an Englishman to help a compatriot in a foreign country. And yet I'm convinced that she knew I suspected and disliked her." "How long did she stay out there?" asked Miss Marple. "I think it was about a fortnight. Miss Durrant was buried there, and it must have been about 10 days later when she took a boat back to England. The shock had upset her so much that she felt she couldn't spend the winter there as she had planned. That's what she said." "Did it seem to have upset her?" asked Miss Marple. The doctor hesitated. "Well, I don't know that it affected her appearance at all," he said cautiously. "She didn't, for instance, grow fatter?" asked Miss Marple. "Do you know, it's a curious thing your saying that. Now I come to think back, I believe you're right. Yes, she did seem, if anything, to be putting on weight." "How horrible," said Jane Hillier with a shudder. It's like fattening on your victim's blood." "And yet, in another way, I may be doing her an injustice," went on Dr. Lloyd. "She certainly said something before she left which pointed in an entirely different direction." There may be, I think there are, consciences which work very slowly, which take some time to awake the enormity of the deed committed. It was the evening before her departure from the Canaries. She had asked me to go and see her, and had thanked me very warmly for all that I had done to help her. I, of course, made light of the matter, said I had only done what was natural under the circumstances, and so on. There was a pause after that, and then she suddenly asked me a question. "Do you think," she asked, "that one is ever justified in taking the law into one's own hands?" I replied that that was rather a difficult question, but on the whole I thought not. The law was the law, and we had to abide by it, even when it is powerless. I don't quite understand. It's difficult to explain, but one might do something that is considered definitely wrong, that is considered a crime even, for a very good and sufficient reason. I replied dryly that possibly several criminals had thought that in their time, and she shrank back. "Oh, but that's horrible," she murmured. "Horrible." And then, with a change of tone, she asked me to give her something to make her sleep. She had not been able to sleep properly since, she hesitated, since that terrible shock. "You're sure it is that? There's nothing worrying you, nothing on your mind?" "On my mind? What should be on my mind?" She spoke fiercely and suspiciously. "Worry is a cause of sleeplessness sometimes," I said lightly. She seemed to brood for a moment. "Do you mean worrying over the future, or worrying over the past, which can't be altered?" "Either. Only it wouldn't be any good worrying over the past. You couldn't bring back... Oh, what's the use? One mustn't think. One must not think." I prescribed her a mild sleeping draught and made my adieu. As I went away I wondered not a little over the words she had spoken. You couldn't bring back... what? Or who? I think that last interview prepared me in a way for what was to come. I didn't expect it, of course, but when it happened I wasn't surprised. Because, you see, Mary Barton struck me all along as a conscientious woman, not a weak sinner, but a woman with convictions who would act up to them and who would not relent as long as she still believed in them. I fancied that in that last conversation we had, she was beginning to doubt her own convictions. I know her words suggested to me that she was feeling the first faint beginnings of that terrible soul-searcher, remorse. The thing happened in Cornwall, in a small watering place, rather deserted at that season of the year. Must have been, let me see, late March. I read about it in the papers. A lady had been staying at a small hotel there, a Miss Barton. She'd been very odd and peculiar in her manner. That had been noticed by all. At night she would walk up and down her room, muttering to herself and not allowing the people on either side of her to sleep. She called on the vicar one day and told him that she had a communication of the gravest importance to make to him. She had, she said, committed a crime. Then, instead of proceeding, she had stood up abruptly and said she would call another day. The vicar put her down as being slightly unbalanced, and did not take her self-accusation seriously. The very next morning she was found to be missing from her room. A note was left addressed to the coroner. It ran as follows: "I tried to speak to the vicar yesterday to confess all, but was not allowed. She would not let me. I can make amends only one way. A life for a life, and my life must go the same way as hers did. I, too, must drown in the deep sea. I believed I was justified. I see now that that was not so. If I desire Amy's forgiveness, I must go to her. Let no one be blamed for my death. Mary Barton. Her clothes were found lying on the beach in a secluded cove nearby, and it seemed clear that she had undressed there and swum resolutely out to sea, where the current was known to be dangerous, sweeping one down the coast. The body was not discovered, but after a time leave was given to presume death. She was a rich woman, her estate being proved at £100,000. Since she died intestate, it all went to her next of kin, a family of cousins in Australia. The papers made discreet references to the tragedy in the Canary Islands, putting forward the theory that the death of Miss Durrant had unhinged her friend's brain. At the inquest, the usual verdict of suicide whilst temporarily insane was returned. And so the curtain falls on the tragedy of Amy Durrant and Mary Barton. There was a long pause, and then Jane Hellyer gave a great gasp. "Oh, but you mustn't stop there. Just in the most interesting part. Go on." "But you see, Miss Hellyer, this isn't a serial story. This is real life. And real life stops just where it chooses." "But I don't want it to," said Jane. "I want to know." "This is where we use our brains, Miss Hellyer," explained Sir Henry. "Why did Mary Barton kill her companion? That's the problem Dr. Lloyd has set us." "Oh, well," said Miss Hellyer, "she might have killed her for lots of reasons. I mean, I don't know, she might have got on her nerves, or else she got jealous, although Dr. Lloyd doesn't mention any men. But still, on the boat out, well, you know what everyone says about boats and sea voyages." Miss Hellyer paused, slightly out of breath, and it was borne in upon her audience that the outside of Jane's charming head was distinctly superior to the inside. "I would like to have a lot of guesses," said Mrs. Bantry, "and I suppose I must confine myself to one. Well, I think that Miss Barton's father made all his money out of ruining Amy Durrant's father, so Amy determined to have her revenge. Oh, no, it's the wrong way round. How tiresome. Why does the rich employer kill the humble companion? I've got it. Miss Barton had a young brother who shot himself for love of Amy Durrant. Miss Barton waits her time. Amy comes down in the world. Miss B engages her as a companion and takes her to the Canaries and accomplishes her revenge. Now, how's that?" "Excellent," said Sir Henry, "only we don't know that Miss Barton ever had a young brother." "We deduce that," said Mrs. Bantry. "Unless she had a young brother, there's no motive, so she must have had a young brother. Do you see, Watson?" "Well, that's all very fine, Dolly," said our husband, "but it's only a guess." "Of course it is," said Mrs. Bantry. "That's all we can do, guess. We haven't got any clues." "Go on, dear, have a guess yourself." "Upon my word, I don't know what to say, but I think there's something in Miss Hellyer's suggestion that they fell out about a man. Now, look here, Dolly, it was probably some high church parson. They both embroidered him a cope or something, and he wore the Durrant woman's first. Depend upon it, it was something like that. Look how she went off to a parson at the end. These women all lose their heads over good-looking clergymen. You hear of it over and over again." "I think I must try and make my explanation a little more subtle," said Sir Henry, "though I admit it's only a guess. I suggest that Miss Barton was always mentally unhinged. There are more cases like that than you would imagine. Her mania grew stronger, and she began to believe it her duty to rid the world of certain persons, possibly what is termed unfortunate females. Nothing much is known about Miss Durrant's past, so very possibly she had a past, an unfortunate one. Miss Barton learns of this and decides on extermination. Later, the righteousness of her act begins to trouble her, and she's overcome by remorse. Her end shows her to be completely unhinged. Now, do say you agree with me, Miss Marple. "I'm afraid I don't, Sir Henry," said Miss Marple, smiling apologetically. "I think her end shows her to have been a very clever and resourceful woman." Jane Helier interrupted with a little scream. Oh, I've been so stupid. May I guess again? Of course it must have been that. Blackmail. The companion woman was blackmailing her, only I don't see why Miss Marple says it was clever of her to kill herself. I can't see that at all. "Ah," said Sir Henry, "you see, Miss Marple knew a case just like it in St. Mary Mead." "You always laugh at me, Sir Henry," said Miss Marple reproachfully. "I must confess it does remind me just a little of old Mrs. Trout. She drew the old-age pension, you know, for 3 old women who were dead in different parishes." "Sounds like a most complicated and resourceful crime," said Sir Henry, "but it doesn't seem to throw much light upon our present problem." "Of course not," said Miss Marple. "It wouldn't, to you. But some of the families were very poor, and the old-age pension was a great boon to the children. I know it's difficult for anyone outside to understand, but what I really meant was that the whole thing hinged upon one old woman being so like any other old woman." "Eh?" said Sir Henry, mystified. "I always explain things so badly. What I mean is that when Dr. Lloyd described the 2 ladies first, he didn't know which was which, and I don't suppose anyone else in the hotel did. They would have, of course, after a day or so, but the very next day one of the 2 was drowned. And if the one who was left said she was Miss Barton, I don't suppose it would ever occur to anyone else that she might be." "You think—" "Oh, I see," said Sir Henry slowly. "It's the only natural way of thinking of it. Dear Mrs. Bantry began that way just now. Why should the rich employer kill the humble companion? So much more likely to be the other way about. I mean, that's the way things happen." "Is it?" said Sir Henry. "You shock me." "But of course," went on Miss Marple, "she would have had to wear Miss Barton's clothes, and they would probably be a little tight on her, so that her general appearance would look as though she had got a little fatter. That's why I asked that question. A gentleman would be sure to think it was the lady who had got fatter, and not the clothes that got smaller, though that isn't quite the right way of putting it. But if Amy Durrant kills Miss Barton, what did she gain by it?" asked Mrs. Bantry. "She couldn't keep up the deception forever." "She only kept it up for another month or so," pointed out Miss Marple, "and during that time I expect she travelled, keeping away from anyone who might know her. That's what I meant by saying that one lady of a certain age looks so like another. I don't suppose the different photograph on her passport was ever noticed. You know what passports are. And then in March she went down to this Cornish place and began to act queerly and draw attention to herself, so that when people found her clothes on the beach and read her last letter, they shouldn't think of the common-sense conclusion." "Which was?" asked Sir Henry. "No body," said Miss Marple firmly. "That's the thing that would stare you in the face if there weren't such a lot of red herrings to draw you off the trail, including the suggestion of foul play and remorse. No body. That was the real significant fact." "Do you mean," said Mrs. Bantry, "do you mean that there wasn't any remorse, that she didn't drown herself?" "Not she," said Miss Marple. It's just Mrs. Trout over again. Mrs. Trout was very good at red herrings, but she met her match in me, and I can see through your remorse-driven Miss Barton. Drowned herself? Went off to Australia, if I'm any good at guessing." "You are, Miss Marple," said Dr. Lloyd. "Undoubtedly you are." Now it again took me quite by surprise. "Why, you could have knocked me down with a feather that day in Melbourne." "Was that what you spoke of as a final coincidence?" Dr. Lloyd nodded. "Yes, it was rather rough luck on Miss Barton, or Miss Amy Durrant, whatever you like to call her. I became a ship's doctor for a while, and landing in Melbourne, the first person I saw as I walked down the street was the lady I thought had been drowned in Cornwall. She saw the game was up as far as I was concerned, and she did the bold thing. Took me into her confidence. Curious woman, completely lacking, I suppose, in some moral sense. She was the eldest of a family of 9, all wretchedly poor. They had applied once for help to their rich cousin in England and been repulsed. Miss Barton having quarrelled with their father. Money was wanted desperately, for the 3 youngest children were delicate and wanted expensive medical treatment. Amy Barton, then and there, seems to have decided on her plan of cold-blooded murder. She set out for England, working her passage over as a children's nurse. She obtained the situation of companion to Miss Barton, calling herself Amy Durrant. She engaged a room and put some furniture in it so as to create more of a personality for herself. The drowning plan was a sudden inspiration. She'd been waiting for some opportunity to present itself. Then she staged the final scene of the drama and returned to Australia. And in due time she and her brothers and sisters inherited Miss Barton's money as next of kin. "A very bold and perfect crime," said Sir Henry. "Almost the perfect crime. If it had been Miss Barton who had died in the Canaries, suspicion might have attached to Amy Durrant, and her connection with the Barton family might have been discovered. But the change of identity and the double crime, as you may call it, effectually did away with that. Yes, almost the perfect crime." "What happened to her?" asked Mrs. Bantry. "What did you do in the matter, Dr. Lloyd?" "I was in a very curious position, Mrs. Bantry. Of evidence, as the law understands it, I still had very little. Also, there were certain signs, plain to me as a medical man, that though strong and vigorous in appearance, the lady was not long for this world. I went home with her and saw the rest of the family. A charming family, devoted to their elder sister, and without an idea in their heads that she might prove to have committed a crime. Why bring sorrow on them when I could prove nothing? The lady's admission to me was unheard by anyone else. I let nature take its course. Miss Amy Barton died 6 months after my meeting with her. I've often wondered if she was cheerful and unrepentant up to the end." "Surely not," said Mrs. Bantry. "I expect so," said Miss Marple. "Mrs. Trout was." Jane Helier gave herself a little shake. "Well," she said, "it's very, very thrilling. I don't quite understand now who drowned which. And how does this Mrs. Trout come into it?" "She doesn't, my dear," said Miss Marple. "She was only a person, not a very nice person, in the village." "Oh," said Jane, "in the village. But nothing ever happens in a village, does it?" She sighed. "Oh, I'm sure I shouldn't have any brains at all if I lived in a village." A Christmas Tragedy. "I have a complaint to make," said Sir Henry Clithering. His eyes twinkled gently as he looked round at the assembled company. Colonel Bantry, his legs stretched out, was frowning at the mantelpiece as though it were a delinquent soldier on parade. His wife was surreptitiously glancing at a catalogue of bulbs which had come by the late post. Dr. Lloyd was gazing with frank admiration at Jane Helier, and that beautiful young actress herself was thoughtfully regarding her pink-polished nails. Only that elderly spinster lady, Miss Marple, was sitting bolt upright, and her faded blue eyes met Sir Henry's with an answering twinkle. "A complaint," she murmured. "A very serious complaint. We are a company of 6, 3 representatives of each sex, and I protest on behalf of the downtrodden males. We have had 3 stories told tonight, and told by the 3 men. I protest that the ladies have not done their fair share." "Oh," said Mrs. Bantry with indignation, "I'm sure we have. We listened with the most intelligent appreciation. We've displayed the true womanly attitude, not wishing to thrust ourselves into the limelight." "It's an excellent excuse," said Sir Henry, "but it won't do. And there's a very good precedent in the Arabian Nights. So, forward, Scheherazade." "Meaning me," said Mrs. Bantry, "but I haven't anything to tell. I've never been surrounded by blood or mystery." "I don't absolutely insist upon blood," said Sir Henry, "but I'm sure one of you 3 ladies has got a pet mystery. Come now, Miss Marple, the curious coincidence of the charwoman, or the mystery of the mothers' meeting. Oh, don't disappoint me in St. Mary's Mead." Miss Marple shook her head. "Nothing that would interest you, Sir Henry. We have our little mysteries, of course. There was that Jill of picked shrimps that disappeared so incomprehensibly, but that wouldn't interest you, because it all turned out to be so trivial, though throwing a considerable light on human nature." "You've taught me to dote on human nature," said Sir Henry solemnly. "What about you, Miss Helier?" asked Colonel Bantry. "You must have had some interesting experiences." "Yes, indeed," said Dr. Lloyd. "Me," said Jane. "You mean you want me to tell you something that happened to me?" "Or to one of your friends," lamented Sir Henry. "Oh," said Jane vaguely, I don't think anything's ever happened to me. I mean, not that kind of thing. Flowers, of course, and queer messages, but that's just men, isn't it? I don't think—" She paused and appeared lost in thought. "I see we shall have to have that epic of the shrimp," said Sir Henry. "Now then, Miss Marple." "You're so fond of your jokes, Sir Henry. The shrimps are only nonsense. But now I come to think of it, I do remember one incident. At least, not exactly an incident. Something very much more serious, a tragedy. And I was, in a way, mixed up in it. And for what I did, I've never had any regrets. No regrets at all. But it didn't happen in St. Mary Mead." "That disappoints me," said Sir Henry. "But I'll endeavour to bear up. I knew we should not rely upon you in vain." He settled himself in the attitude of a listener. Miss Marple grew slightly pink. I hope I shall be able to tell it properly," she said anxiously. "I fear I am very inclined to become rambling. One wanders from the point altogether without knowing that one is doing so. And it's so hard to remember each fact in its proper order. You must all bear with me if I tell my story badly. It happened a very long time ago now. As I say, it was not connected with St. Mary Mead. As a matter of fact, it had to do with a hydro." "Do you mean a seaplane?" asked Jane with wide eyes. "You wouldn't know, dear," said Mrs. Bantry, and explained. Her husband added his quota. "Beastly places, absolutely beastly. Got to get up early and drink filthy-tasting water. Lot of old women sitting about, ill-natured tittle-tattle. God, when I think—" "Now, Arthur," said Mrs. Bantry placidly, "you know it did you all the good in the world." "Lot of old women sitting round talking scandal," grunted Colonel Bantry. "That, I'm afraid, is true," said Miss Marple. "I myself—" "My dear Miss Marple," cried the Colonel, horrified, "I didn't mean for one moment—" With pink cheeks and a little gesture of the hand, Miss Marple stopped him. "Oh, but it's true, Colonel Bantry. Oh, now, I should just like to say this. Now, let me recollect my thoughts. Yes, talking scandal, as you say, well, it is done a good deal, and people are very down on it, especially young people. My nephew, who writes books, and very clever ones, I believe, has said the most scathing things about taking people's characters away without any kind of proof, and how wicked it is and all that. But what I say is that none of these young people ever stop to think. They really don't examine the facts. Surely the whole crux of the matter is this. How often is tittle-tattle, as you call it, true? And I think if, as I say, they really examined the facts, they would find that it was true 9 times out of 10. That's really just what makes people so annoyed about it. The inspired guess, said Sir Henry. No, not that at all. It's really a matter of practice and experience. An Egyptologist, so I've heard, if you show him one of those curious little beetles, can tell you by the look and the feel of the thing what date BC it is, or if it's a Birmingham imitation. And he can't always give a definite rule for doing so, he just knows. His life has been spent handling such things. And that's what I'm trying to say, very badly, I know. What my nephew calls superfluous women have a lot of time on their hands, and their chief interest is usually people. And so, you see, they get to be what one might call experts. Now, young people nowadays, they talk very freely about things that weren't mentioned in my young days, but on the other hand, their minds are terribly innocent. They believe in everyone and everything, and if one tries to warn them ever so gently, they tell one that one has a Victorian mind, and that, they say, is like a sink. After all, said Sir Henry, what is wrong with a sink? Exactly, said Miss Marple eagerly. It's the most necessary thing in any house, but of course not romantic. Now, I must confess that I have my feelings like everyone else, and I've sometimes been cruelly hurt by unthinking remarks. I know gentlemen are not interested in domestic matters, but I must mention my maid Ethel, a very good-looking girl and obliging in every way. Now, I realized as soon as I saw her that she was the same type as Annie Webb and poor Mrs. Brewitt's girl. If the opportunity arose, mine and thine would mean nothing to her. So I let her go at the month, and I gave her a written reference saying she was honest and sober, but privately I warned old Mrs. Edwards against taking her, and my nephew Raymond was exceedingly angry and said he'd never heard of anything so wicked. Yes, wicked. Well, she went to Lady Ashton, whom I felt no obligation to warn, and what happened? All the lace cut off her underclothes, and 2 diamond brooches taken, and the girl departed in the middle of the night and was never heard of since. Miss Marple paused, drew a long breath, and then went on. You'll be saying this has nothing to do with what went on at Keston Spa Hydro, but it has in a way. It explains why I felt no doubt in my mind, the first moment I saw the Saunders together, that he meant to do away with her. Eh? Said Sir Henry, leaning forward. Miss Marple turned a placid face to him. As I say, Sir Henry, I felt no doubt in my own mind. Mr. Saunders was a big, good-looking, florid-faced man, very hearty in his manner, and popular with all, and nobody could have been pleasanter to his wife than he was. But I knew he meant to make away with her. My dear Miss Marple. Yes, I know. That's what my nephew Raymond West would say. He'd tell me I hadn't a shadow of proof. But I remember Walter Holmes, who kept the Green Man, walking home with his wife one night she fell into the river. And he collected the insurance money. And 1 or 2 other people are walking about scot-free to this day. One indeed in our own class of life. Went to Switzerland for a summer holiday, climbing with his wife. I warned her not to go. The poor dear didn't get angry with me as she might have done. She only laughed. seemed to her funny that a queer old thing like me should say such things about her Harry. Well, well, there was an accident, and Harry is married to another woman now. But what could I do? I knew, but there was no proof. "Oh, Miss Marple," cried Mrs. Bantry, "you don't really mean—" "My dear, these things are very common indeed, and gentlemen are especially tempted, being so much the stronger. So easy if a thing looks like an accident. As I say, I knew at once with the Saunders. It was on a tram. It was full inside, and I had to go on top. We all three got up to get off, and Mr. Saunders lost his balance and fell right against his wife, sending her head first down the stairs. Fortunately, the conductor was a very strong young man and caught her." "But surely that must have been an accident?" "Of course it was an accident. Nothing could have looked more accidental. But Mr. Saunders had been in the merchant navy, so he told me, and a man who can keep his balance on a nasty tilting boat doesn't lose it on the top of a tram, if an old woman like me doesn't. Don't tell me." "At any rate, we can take it that you'd made up your mind, Miss Marple," said Sir Henry. "Made it up then and there." The old lady nodded. "I was sure enough, and another incident in crossing the street not long afterwards made me surer still. Now, I ask you, what could I do, Sir Henry? Here was a nice, contented, happy little married woman shortly going to be murdered." "My dear lady, you take my breath away." "That's because, like most people nowadays, you won't face facts. You prefer to think such a thing couldn't be. But it was so, and I knew it. But one is so sadly handicapped. I couldn't, for instance, go to the police, and to warn the young woman would, I see, be useless. She was devoted to the man. I just made it my business to find out as much as I could about them. One has a lot of opportunities, doing one's needlework round the fire. Mrs. Saunders, Gladys her name was only too willing to talk. It seems they'd not been married very long. Her husband had some property that was coming to him, but for the moment they were very badly off. In fact, they were living on her little income. One has heard that tale before. She bemoaned the fact that she could not touch the capital. It seemed that somebody had had some sense somewhere, but the money was hers to will away. I found that out. And she and her husband had made wills in favour of each other directly after their marriage. Very touching. Of course, when Jack's affairs came right, that was a burden all day long, and in the meantime they were very hard up indeed. Actually had a room on the top floor, all among the servants, and so dangerous in case of fire, though, as it happened, there was a fire escape just outside their window. I inquired carefully if there was a balcony. Dangerous things, balconies. One push, you know. I made her promise not to go out on the balcony. I said I'd had a dream. That impressed her. One can do a lot with superstition sometimes. She was a fair girl, rather washed-out complexion, and an untidy roll of hair on her neck. Very credulous. She repeated what I'd said to her husband, and I noticed him looking at me in a curious way once or twice. He wasn't credulous, and he knew that I'd been on that tram. But I was very worried, terribly worried, because I couldn't see how to circumvent him. I could prevent anything happening at the hydro just by saying a few words to show him I suspected. But that only meant his putting off his plan till later. No, I began to believe that the only policy was a bold one. Somehow or other to lay a trap for him. If I could induce him to attempt her life in a way of my own choosing, Well, then he would be unmasked, and she'd be forced to face the truth, however much of a shock it was to her. "Take my breath away," said Dr. Lloyd. "What conceivable plan could you adopt?" "I'd have found one, never fear," said Miss Marple. "But the man was too clever for me. He didn't wait. He thought I might suspect, and so he struck before I could be sure. He knew I would suspect an accident, so he made it murder." A little gasp went round the circle. Miss Marple nodded and set her lips grimly together. I'm afraid I've put that rather abruptly. I must try and tell you exactly what occurred. I've always felt very bitterly about it. It seems to me that I ought somehow to have prevented it. But doubtless Providence knew best. I did what I could, at all events. There was what I can only describe as a curiously eerie feeling in the air. There seemed to be something weighing on us all, a feeling of misfortune. To begin with, there was George, the hall porter. He'd been there for years and knew everybody. Bronchitis and pneumonia, and passed away on the 4th day. Terribly sad. A real blow to everybody. And 4 days before Christmas, too. And then one of the housemaids, such a nice girl, a septic finger, actually died in 24 hours. I was in the drawing-room with Miss Trollope and old Mrs. Carpenter, and Mrs. Carpenter was being positively ghoulish, relishing it all, you know. "Mark my word," she said, "this isn't the end. You know the saying, never two without three. I've proved it true time and again. There'll be another death, not a doubt of it, and we shan't have long to wait. Never two without three." As she said the last words, nodding her head and clicking her knitting needles, I just chanced to look up, and there was Mr. Saunders standing in the doorway. Just for a minute he was off guard, and I saw the look in his face as plain as plain. I shall believe till my dying day that it was the ghoulishness, Mrs. Carpenter's words, that put the whole thing into his head. I saw his mind working. He came forward into the room, smiling in his genial way. "Any Christmas shopping I can do for you ladies?" he asked. "I'm going down to Keston presently." He stayed a minute or two, laughing and talking, and then went out. As I tell you, I was troubled, and I said straight away, "Where's Mrs. Saunders? Does anyone know?" Mrs. Trollope said she'd gone out to some friends of hers, the Mortimers, to play bridge, and that eased my mind for the moment. But I was still very worried and most uncertain as to what to do. About half an hour later I went up to my room. I met Dr. Coles, my doctor, there coming down the stairs as I was going up, and as I happened to want to consult him about my rheumatism, I took him into my room with me there and then. He mentioned to me then, in confidence, he said, about the death of the poor girl, Mary. The manager didn't want the news to get about, he said, so would I keep it to myself. Of course, I didn't tell him that we'd all been discussing nothing else for the last hour, ever since the poor girl breathed her last. These things are always known at once, and a man of his experience should know that well enough. But Dr. Coles was always a simple, unsuspicious fellow who believed what he wanted to believe, and that's just what alarmed me a minute later. He said as he was leaving that Saunders had asked him to have a look at his wife. It seemed she'd been seedy of late, indigestion, etc. Now, that very same day, Gladys Saunders had said to me that she'd got a wonderful digestion, and was thankful for it. You see, all my suspicions of that man came back 100-fold. He was preparing the way. For what? Dr. Coles left before I could make up my mind whether to speak to him or not, though really, if I had spoken, I shouldn't have known what to say. As I came out of my room, the man himself, Saunders, came down the stairs from the floor above. He was dressed to go out, and he asked me again if he could do anything for me in town. It was all I could do to be civil to the man. I went straight into the lounge and ordered tea. It's just on 5:30, I remember. Now, I'm very anxious to put clearly what happened next. I was still in the lounge at 7:15 when Mr. Saunders came in. There were 2 gentlemen with him, and all 3 of them were inclined to be a little on the lively side. Mr. Saunders left his 2 friends and came right over to where I was sitting with Miss Trollope. He explained that he wanted our advice about a Christmas present he was giving his wife. It was an evening bag. "And you see, ladies," he said, "I'm only a rough sailor man. What do I know about such things? I've had 3 sent to me on approval, and I want an expert opinion on them." We said, of course, that we would be delighted to help him, and he asked if we'd mind coming upstairs, as his wife might come in any minute if he brought the bags down. So we went up with him. I shall never forget what happened next. I can feel my little fingers tingling now. Mr. Saunders opened the door of the bedroom and switched on the light. I don't know which of us saw it first. Mrs. Saunders was lying on the floor, face downwards, dead. I got to her first. I knelt down and took her hand and felt for the pulse, but it was useless. The arm itself was cold and stiff. Just by her head was a stocking filled with sand, the weapon she had been struck down with. Miss Trollope, silly creature, was moaning and moaning by the door and holding her head. Saunders gave a great cry of, my wife, and rushed to her. I stopped him touching her. You see, I was sure at the moment that he'd done it, and there might have been something that he wanted to take away or hide. Nothing must be touched, I said. Pull yourself together, Mr. Saunders. Miss Trollope, please go down and fetch the manager. I stayed there, kneeling by the body. I wasn't going to leave Saunders alone with it. And yet I was forced to admit that if the man was acting, he was acting marvellously. He looked dazed and bewildered and scared out of his wits. The manager was with us in no time. He made a quick inspection of the room, then turned us all out and locked the door, the key of which he took. Then he went off and telephoned to the police. Seemed a positive age before they came. We learnt afterwards that the line was out of order. The manager had to send a messenger to the police station, and the hydro is right out of the town upon the edge of the moor, and Mrs. Carpenter tried us all very severely. She was so pleased at her prophecy of never 2 without 3 coming true so quickly. Saunders, I hear, wandered out into the grounds, clutching his head and groaning and displaying every sign of grief. However, the police came at last. They went upstairs with the manager and Mr. Saunders. Later they sent down for me. I went up. The inspector was there sitting at a table writing. He was an intelligent-looking man, and I liked him. "Miss Jane Marple," he said. "Yes. I understand, madam, that you were present when the body of the deceased was found." I said I was, and I described exactly what had occurred. I think it was a relief to the poor man to find someone who could answer his questions coherently, having previously had to deal with Saunders and Emily Trollope, who I gather was completely demoralized. She would be, the silly creature. I remember my dear mother teaching me that a gentlewoman should always be able to control herself in public, however much she may give way in private. "An admirable maxim," said Sir Henry gravely. When I had finished, the inspector said, Thank you, madam. Now, I'm afraid I must ask you just to look at the body once more. Is that exactly the position in which it was lying when you entered the room? It hasn't been moved in any way?" I explained that I had prevented Mr. Saunders from doing so, and the inspector nodded approval. "The gentleman seems terribly upset," he remarked. "He seems so, yes," I replied. I don't think I put any special emphasis on the seams, but the inspector looked at me rather keenly. "So we can take it that the body is exactly as it was when found," he said. "Except for the hat, yes," I replied. The inspector looked up sharply. "What do you mean, the hat?" I explained that the hat had been on poor Gladys's head, whereas now it was lying beside her. I thought, of course, that the police had done this. The inspector, however, denied it emphatically. Nothing had as yet been moved or touched. He looked down at that poor prone figure with a puzzled frown. Gladys was dressed in her outdoor clothes, a big dark red tweed coat with a grey fur collar. The hat, a cheap affair of red felt, lay just by her head. The inspector stood for some minutes in silence, frowning to himself. Then an idea struck him. "Can you by any chance remember, madam, whether there were earrings in the ears, or whether the deceased habitually wore earrings?" Now, fortunately, I am in the habit of observing closely. I remembered that there had been a glint of pearls just below the hat brim, though I had paid no particular notice to it at the time. I was able to answer his first question in the affirmative. "Then that settles it. The lady's jewel case was rifled, not that she had anything much of value, I understand, and the rings were taken from her fingers. The murderer must have forgotten the earrings and come back for them after the murder was discovered. A cool customer, or perhaps—" He stared round the room and said slowly, "He may have been concealed here in this room all the time." But I negatived that idea. I myself, I explained, had looked under the bed, and the manager had opened the door to the wardrobe. There was nowhere else where a man could hide. It's true the hat cupboard was locked in the middle of the wardrobe, but as that was only a shallow affair with shelves, no one could have been concealed there. The inspector nodded his head slowly while I explained all this. "I'll take your word for it, madam," he said. "In that case, as I said before, he must have come back. A very cool customer." But the manager locked the door and took the key. "That's nothing. The balcony and the fire escape, that's the way the thief came. Why, as likely as not, you continually disturbed him at work. He slips out of the window, and when you've all gone, back he comes and goes on with his business." "You are sure," I said, "that there was a thief?" He said dryly, "Well, it looks like it, doesn't it?" But something in his tone satisfied me. I felt that he wouldn't take Mr. Saunders in the role of the bereaved widower too seriously. You see, I admitted frankly I was absolutely under the opinion of what I believe our neighbours the French call the idée fixe. I knew that that man, Saunders, intended his wife to die. What I didn't allow for was that strange and fantastic thing, coincidence. My views about Mr. Saunders were, I was sure of it, absolutely right and true. The man was a scoundrel. But although his hypocritical assumptions of grief didn't deceive me for a minute, I do remember feeling at the time that his surprise and bewilderment were marvellously well done. They seemed absolutely natural, if you know what I mean. I must admit that after my conversation with the inspector, a curious feeling of doubt crept over me, because if Saunders had done this dreadful thing, I couldn't imagine any conceivable reason why he should creep back by means of the fire escape and take the earrings from his wife's ears. It wouldn't have been a sensible thing to do. And Sanders was very much a sensible man. That's just why I always felt he was so dangerous. Miss Marple looked round at her audience. You see, perhaps, what I'm coming to? It is so often the unexpected that happens in this world. I was so sure, and that, I think, was what blinded me. The result came as a shock to me, for it was proved beyond any possible doubt that Mr. Sanders could not possibly have committed the crime. A surprised gasp came from Mrs. Bantry. Miss Marple turned to her. "I know, my dear, that isn't what you expected when I began this story. It wasn't what I expected, but facts are facts, and if one is proved to be wrong, one must just be humble about it and start again. That Mr. Sanders was a murderer at heart, I knew, and nothing ever occurred to upset that firm conviction of mine. And now I expect you'd like to hear the actual facts themselves. Mrs. Sanders, as you know, spent the afternoon playing bridge with some friends, the Mortimers. She left them at about 6:15. From her friend's house to the hydro was about 1/4 of an hour's walk, less if one hurried. She must have come in then about 6:30. No one saw her come in, so she must have entered by the side door and hurried straight up to her room. There she changed. The fawn coat and skirt she wore to the bridge party were hanging up in the cupboard, and was evidently preparing to go out again when the blow fell. Quite possibly, they say, she never even knew who struck her. The sandbag, I understand, is a very efficient weapon. That looks as though the attackers were concealed in the room, possibly in one of the big wardrobe cupboards, the one that she didn't open. Now, as to the movement of Mr. Sanders, he went out, as I have said, at about 5:30 or a little after. He did some shopping at a couple of shops, and at about 6 o'clock he entered the Grand Spa Hotel, where he encountered 2 friends, the same with whom he returned to the hydro later. They played billiards, and I gather had a good many whiskies and sodas together. These 2 men, Hitchcock and Spender their names were actually with him the whole time from 6 o'clock onwards. They walked back to the hydro with him, and he only left them to come across to me and Miss Trollope. That, as I told you, was about 6:45, at which time his wife must have been already dead. I must tell you that I talked myself to these 2 friends of his. I did not like them. They were neither pleasant nor gentlemanly men, but I was quite certain of one thing, that they were speaking the absolute truth when they said that Sanders had been the whole time in their company. There was just one other little point that came up. It seems that while bridge was going on, Mrs. Sanders was called to the telephone. A Mr. Littleworth wanted to speak to her. She seemed both excited and pleased about something, and incidentally made 1 or 2 bad mistakes. She left rather earlier than they had expected her to do. Mr. Sanders was asked whether he knew the name of Littleworth as being one of his wife's friends, but he declared he'd never heard of anyone of that name. And to me that seems borne out by his wife's attitude. She, too, did not seem to know the name of Littleworth. Nevertheless, she came back from the telephone, smiling and blushing, so it looks as though whoever it was did not give his real name. And that in itself has a suspicious aspect, does it not? Anyway, that is the problem that was left. The burglar story, which seems unlikely, or the alternative theory that Mrs. Sanders was preparing to go out and meet somebody. Did that somebody come to her room by means of the fire escape? Was there a quarrel? Or did he treacherously attack her? Miss Marple stopped. "Well," said Sir Henry, "what is the answer?" I wondered if any of you could guess. "I'm never good at guessing," said Mrs. Bantry. "It seems a pity that Sanders had such a wonderful alibi, but if it satisfied you, it must have been all right." Jane Helier moved her beautiful head and asked a question. "Why," she said, "was the hat cupboard locked?" "How very clever of you, my dear," said Miss Marple, beaming. "That's just what I wondered myself, though the explanation was quite simple. In it were a pair of embroidered slippers and some pocket handkerchiefs that the poor girl was embroidering for her husband for Christmas. That's why she locked the cupboard. The key was found in her handbag." "Oh," said Jane, "then it isn't very interesting after all." "Oh, but it is," said Miss Marple. "Just the one really interesting thing. The thing that made all the murderer's plans go wrong." Everyone stared at the old lady. "I didn't see it myself for 2 days," said Miss Marple. "I puzzled and puzzled, and then suddenly there it was, all clear. I went to the inspector and asked him to try something, and he did." "What did you ask him to try?" "I asked him to fit that hat on the poor girl's head. And of course he couldn't. It wouldn't go on. It wasn't her hat, you see." Mrs. Bantry stared. "But it was on her head to begin with." "Not on her head." Miss Marple stopped a moment to let the words sink in, and then went on. "We took it for granted that it was poor Gladys's body there, but we never looked at the face. She was face downward, remember, and the hat hid everything." "But she was killed." "Yes, later. At the moment that we were telephoning to the police, Gladys Sanders was alive and well." "You mean it was someone pretending to be her? But surely when you touched her—" "It was a dead body, right enough," said Miss Marple gravely. "But dash it all," said Colonel Bantry, "you can't get hold of dead bodies right and left. What did he do with the first corpse afterwards?" "He put it back," said Miss Marple. "It was a wicked idea, but a very clever one. It was our talk in the drawing-room that put it into his head. The body of poor Mary, the housemaid. Why not use it? Remember, the Sanders room was up among the servants' quarters. Mary's door was 2 doors off. The undertakers wouldn't come till after dark. He counted on that. He carried the body along to the balcony. It was dark at 5, dressed it in one of his wife's dresses and her big red coat, and then he found the hat cupboard locked. There was only one thing to be done. He fetched one of the poor girl's own hats. No one would notice. He put the sandbag down beside her. Then he went off to establish his alibi. He telephoned to his wife, calling himself Mr. Littleworth. I don't know what he said to her. She was a credulous girl, as I said just now. But he got her to leave the bridge party early and not to go back to the hydro, and arranged with her to meet him in the grounds of the hydro near the fire escape at 7 o'clock. He probably told her he had some surprise for her. He returns to the hydro with his friends and arranges that Miss Trollope and I shall discover the crime with him. He even pretends to turn the body over, and I stop him. Then the police are sent for, and he staggers out into the grounds. Nobody asked him for an alibi after the crime. He meets his wife, takes her up to the fire escape. They enter their room. Perhaps he has already told her some story about the body. She stoops over it, and he picks up his sandbag and strikes. Oh, dear. Makes me sick to think of, even now. Then quickly he strips off her coat and skirt, hangs them up, and dresses her in the clothes from the other body. But the hat won't go on. Mary's head is shingled. Gladys Sanders, as I say, had a great bun of hair. He is forced to leave it beside the body and hope no one will notice. Then he carries poor Mary's body back to her own room and arranges it decorously once more. "Seems incredible," said Dr. Lloyd. "The risks he took. The police might have arrived too soon." "You remember the line was out of order," said Miss Marple. "That was a piece of his work. He couldn't afford to have the police on the spot too soon. When they did come, they spent some time in the manager's office before going up to the bedroom. That was the weakest point. The chance that someone might notice the difference between a body that had been dead 2 hours and one that had been dead just over half an hour. But he counted on the fact that the people who first discovered the crime would have no expert knowledge." Dr. Lloyd nodded. "The crime would be supposed to have been committed about 6:45 or thereabouts, I suppose," he said. "It was actually committed at 7 or a few minutes after. When the police surgeon examined the body, it would be about 7:30 at earliest. He couldn't possibly tell." "I am the person who should have known," said Miss Marple. "I felt the poor girl's hand, and it was icy cold. Yet a short time later the inspector spoke as though the murder must have been committed just before we arrived. And I saw nothing." "I think you saw a good deal, Miss Marple," said Sir Henry. "The case was before my time. I don't even remember hearing of it. What happened?" "Sanders was hanged," said Miss Marple crisply, "and a good job, too. Never regretted my part in bringing that man to justice. I've no patience with modern humanitarian scruples about capital punishments." Her stern face softened. "But I've often reproached myself bitterly with failing to save the life of that poor girl. But who would have listened to an old woman jumping to conclusions? Well, who knows? Perhaps it was better for her to die while life was still happy than it would have been for her to live on, unhappy and disillusioned, in a world that would have seemed suddenly horrible. She loved that scoundrel and trusted him. She never found him out." "Well, then," said Jane Hiller, "she was all right, quite all right. I wish—" Miss Marple looked at the famous, the beautiful, the successful Jane Helier, and nodded her head gently. "I see, my dear," she said very gently. "I see."